Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Cynthia noticed it a long time ago. Sometimes strange and sometimes even inexplicable events happen in the surgery department. A person is brought in, and it seems that he has only 5 minutes to live, maybe even less. Especially if he is seriously injured or the disease is too neglected. Then everything depends not only on the doctor, but also on the favorable coincidence of circumstances. Of course, we cannot say that in such almost hopeless situations, the doctor should rely only on help from above. No, in severe cases, the surgeon relies on his own knowledge and experience, not forgetting that you need to act decisively without wasting time. Such was the case with Johnny, a homeless man admitted to the ward 2 days ago, just as Cynthia was on night duty. "Cynthia, there's something wrong," Megan ran into the resident's room and exclaimed. Cynthia looked at the nurse in surprise. Megan was new to the department, but she had already proved herself to be a good nurse. She was not afraid of heavy patients and had a strong nerve. "What's up? Did you see a ghost?" Cynthia asked with a touch of irony. "I wish I had. There's a homeless man, wounded, penetrating stab wound, came in and collapsed on the floor. Right in the emergency room," Megan blurted out. Cynthia's face changed immediately when she heard that. In a case like this, every second counts. You can't afford to delay. Prep the operating theater. "I'll be right there," she said. "But we're a private clinic. Should we call the police?" The nurse hesitated. "We will, but later. Right now we have to save the victim. We'll do the rest afterwards," Cynthia said rather stiffly. The nurse nodded in agreement and hurried to carry out the doctor's orders. Cynthia, on the other hand, hesitated. A stab wound in a homeless man. Cynthia wondered. The clinic was indeed private. And what would Superintendent Walter have to say about it tomorrow morning? As head of the clinic, they're tight-knit. Paid rooms, overpriced medication. Even though the clinic is private. She's going to get in trouble for that surgery. All right, so now we're just going to leave poor Johnny bleeding in the street. What about the doctor's oath? No. Whatever happens. Cynthia decided to take action and began to prepare for the operation. Johnny looked to be in his early 30s. He had no time to give his name or the circumstances of his injuries. After all, he had only managed to get to the clinic and collapsed on the floor. Cynthia realized at once that the injury was serious. According to statistics, the lethal outcome of such abdominal injuries is almost 80%. This meant that the operation was likely to fail. The nurse who was to be her assistant realized this. But Cynthia was certainly not going to give up early. She was determined to fight on, no matter what. The operation was complicated. In Cynthia's memory, there were only 2 or 2 of those. For a long time, she couldn't stop the bleeding, which threatened to kill the patient. As it turned out later, Johnny had a rare blood type, which made the task much more difficult. A couple of times, Cynthia wanted to let go of the clamp and simply burst into tears, admitting to herself that there was nothing she could do. Probably such moments occur in the life of everyone who has ever been on the verge of despair. Sensing the doctor's condition, the operating nurse tried not to lose her composure and clearly fulfill all tasks. At one point, there was even a threat of cardiac arrest in the patient, but Cynthia coped. She was able to normalize vital signs and did the near impossible. By the end of the 4-hour surgery, she was barely on her feet from fatigue and despite her inner tension. "Cynthia, we won." "Are you a real magician?" said the operating room nurse Veronica with a smile. "Oh, come on, you don't say." "That's not me," just lucky replied Cynthia. "But my grandmother, Mrs. Amanda, a field surgeon, was a magician. She was the one who could get even the most hopeless back on their feet. The rest of the shift flew by. Johnny was surprisingly strong and was clearly going to pull through. After checking his condition, Cynthia nodded with satisfaction. There you'll live. The main thing is to make sure that the lesson is good for you. Many people don't notice such signs of doom. Naturally, the patient could not respond to the doctor's remark, as he was in a medically induced coma. Cynthia could only hope that Johnny would accept her mental attitude. A new day began and new troubles began. Soon the clinic was filling up again with the medical staff who had come on shift during the day. Here Cynthia was in for a very unpleasant surprise. When the police officers, together with Walter, arrived at the ward, they interviewed the nurse on duty and carefully recorded her statements. They spoke to Megan and Veronica, who, while admiring Cynthia's professionalism, put it all out there. "Cynthia, you've caused us a lot of trouble. Why did you get involved with that homeless guy?" Walter, the superintendent, hissed. "What's wrong, Walter?" "Well, what was I supposed to do in that case?" Cynthia asked him in surprise. He looked at her with undisguised anger. "What's wrong, Cynthia?" "Everything is wrong. That tramp is a wanted man, you know. He's kidnapped the 8-year-old son of a businessman, Mr. Jonathan Henderson. The CCTV footage shows the tramp taking the boy to the park. And after that, Bruce Henderson was never seen again. You get it? This Johnny of yours is a murderer and a criminal who should be tried on the spot. What makes you think he had anything to do with the kidnapping? Maybe it wasn't like that." Cynthia frowned. "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Cynthia. It wasn't like that. And what was it like then? Pray tell. If you'd had children of your own, then you'd know that little boys shouldn't go out with tramps," Walter exclaimed angrily. At the mention of children, Cynthia's face darkened. She really had no children, so it was a blow to the heart, but that was not what upset her. It was that the Henderson family name was familiar to her. Her husband, Kevin, had recently considered himself a business associate of Mr. Jonathan Henderson. Cynthia herself was not acquainted with the businessman, but she had heard very conflicting information about him. It was said that Mr. Jonathan Henderson had made his fortune through his wife, Kimberly, who had left him a substantial inheritance and a successful business. The sound of the door opening brought her out of her troubled musings. Kevin was standing on the threshold. His eyes were glowing with anger. "What have you done, Cynthia? Why did you save that bastard?" he blurted out. "There's no place to test him." Walter gloomed and quietly left the office, leaving Cynthia alone with her husband. "Kevin, why are you talking to me like that? Did I give you any reason to?" Her face contorted with anger. "You've got to be kidding me. What excuse do you need? You saved a criminal, you know. And Jonathan Henderson doesn't forgive that. He'll kill you. He'll grind you to a pulp. Just remember," Kevin said. "Today you're a doctor, tomorrow you could be in jail." "Kevin, are you threatening me?" Cynthia turned pale. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "And who rescued that tramp? Do you think the police didn't notice?" "No, they didn't. A private clinic, a surgeon. Tell me, why did he come to your shift? Why did he choose a private clinic instead of going to the city hospital? Maybe the drifter was counting on something? Or knew something?" Cynthia turned pale. Frankly speaking, she had not expected her husband to talk to her in such a way, which turned into a real interrogation. Could she have done anything differently? Should she have left the man to bleed to death? Even if he was a criminal, how could she know that Johnny was involved in some kind of kidnapping? Although the accusation against him sounds naive to say the least. Just because a boy was seen with a tramp doesn't mean anything. The boy could have just got lost and wandered off. After all, someone hurt Johnny himself, and it's unlikely it was an 8-year-old boy. Especially since, according to Kevin, Bruce walked beside the tramp completely voluntarily. and that's saying something. Cynthia's mood finally soured. Mr. Jonathan was not a man to be trifled with. Neither did the head doctor of the clinic, who was his friend. It didn't take long for Mr. Miles to be summoned, unlike Walter and her husband. He didn't beat around the bush and informed me that Cynthia had been retroactively fired. "But I was just doing my job," she whispered. "And I don't care what you were doing, Cynthia. I don't want any trouble, especially not with Jonathan Henderson. Bruce is his adopted son. His wife's dead. He's become a stepfather to the boy. You see, the tramp's unconscious, but they're going to move him to the prison hospital, and they're looking for the boy. So I had to take action, you know. You'll probably get a criminal record. Jonathan Henderson's going to take it to court. He thinks you were in cahoots with that poor bloke. It's not for nothing that he came to you for help," Mr. Miles said without a trace of embarrassment. Cynthia's eyes brimmed with tears. What does that mean? She could be dismissed from her job just like that. What for? Anyone in her position would have done the same thing. She's a medical professional. Unfortunately, Cynthia couldn't change her boss's mind. How could she? When you're accused and called an accomplice by your own husband, Kevin. Of course, he was clearly overreacting. They'd had a lot of fights before. But it's never gone this far. Was the husband so dependent on this Jonathan Henderson that he could talk like this? It's unthinkable. Just like that, like a magic wand. The effect of a successful operation was replaced by bitter disappointment. Cynthia looked longingly at Johnny, handcuffed to the hospital gurney, and smiled sadly. The tramp was just coming round and helplessly trying to find his savior with his eyes, though it was far from certain that he remembered her face. After all, during the initial examination before the operation, Johnny had been unconscious, delirious the whole time. The dismissal process took a little while. Mr. Miles, eager to please Jonathan Henderson, did everything he could to get Cynthia on the street as soon as possible. Understandably so. The far-sighted head doctor was trying to protect himself from possible repercussions. This way, he could just resign retroactively and be done with it. Cynthia walked out of the clinic and exposed her tear-wet face to the sun. Passers-by passed by and looked in amazement at the young woman with sad gray eyes, who was crying. I didn't feel like going home. After the conversation with Kevin, her soul longed for peace and quiet, but she didn't want to listen to reproaches and accusations. She'd had enough of that. Thank you all for your efforts. Not much to say, for in the middle of the day, silence could only be found in a city park. Cynthia crossed to the opposite side of the street and headed to her desired location. Thanks to the nice weather, the park was crowded. Elderly people, couples strolling around, taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the surrounding beauty, and people who just wanted to be alone with nature. There was a huge fountain in the middle of the park, which provided everyone with a pleasant freshness. Children cheered and squealed, while adults looked on with a smile, remembering themselves as children. Cynthia's mood lightened a little. She walked over to the hot bakery stand and bought a couple of scones to feed the swans and the squirrels scurrying around. The last time she'd done that was a few years ago when she'd first met Kevin. Back then, in that time of romance and bouquets of flowers, they'd taken many walks, visited cafes and cinemas. But all that was in the past. Kevin was very different now. Now he spent a lot of time at work. And when he came home, he often turned into a silent, sullen man. Kevin used to save money on little things, but now he put money aside for everything he could and couldn't afford. And this despite the fact that Cynthia earned a good salary at the private clinic where she had transferred 3 years ago. During that time, she had never regretted her decision. However, the transfer itself was initiated by her husband, who knew her head doctor personally. "How long will you hump in this city surgery?" "A private surgeon has more money and a higher status," Kevin said. Cynthia was hesitant for a long time because she had done her internship in the Department of Surgery, and in fact it was her way into life, but on the other hand, she did not want to stand still either. After all, the saying goes, under the lying stone does not flow water. Only now she realized that her husband Kevin thought only about money, and the transfer to a private clinic had been initiated by him for that very reason. Now that his business interests had intersected with his wife's work, Kevin did not hesitate to do everything he could to defame her. Well, couldn't he have stepped in and said a word? Cynthia thought of Mr. Jonathan. She didn't know the answer to her question, especially as relations with her husband had been rather strained of late. Perhaps this was due to the frequent visits and interference of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly, who came whenever she pleased, and most often on days when Cynthia was resting from her night's duty. Yet Mrs. Kimberly had a constant thirst for activity that had nothing to do with hard work or a love of cleanliness. Most likely she just wanted to find some flaw in Cynthia's impeccable reputation to reproach her for it. For instance, Mrs. Kimberly could easily initiate a general cleaning, knowing full well that Cynthia had returned from a heavy shift. She also never missed a family party so that she could turn up and do her bit. Naturally, Cynthia was patient, as many daughters-in-law are in this world. Showing character right away was not something she wanted to do. She valued Kevin and realized that it was unlikely that her mother-in-law would love her as her own daughter. So she had to take everything for granted and put up with the fact that Mrs. Kimberly was gradually making her life a living hell. A separate topic of conversation from the mouth of her mother-in-law was childlessness. At first it was innocent talk with an undercurrent that hinted very vaguely that Cynthia was infertile. Then Mrs. Kimberly had the courage to speak of it directly. "Look, Cynthia, when do you think you'll have children? You're what, 30, 35? Are you going to go to your son's graduation party when you're retired?" Mrs. Kimberly said ironically. Cynthia turned pale. "Well, you know very well it's not up to us. First one course of treatment, then another. And the case, as they say, hasn't moved," she said. Mrs. Kimberly grinned. Well, let's see what's going on there, because my friends are already laughing at me. When are you going to be a grandmother? They are about to marry their grandchildren, and you still can't get pregnant." Cynthia's tears welled up with resentment. What could she say when medicine was powerless in these cases? No, she had once suggested to Kevin that he take a child from the orphanage, but he had flatly refused. "No, Cynthia, it's not for me. I don't like these adoptions. I don't know what kind of heredity they have. Who are their parents? What if they're criminals or worse, alcoholics? It's all in the genes. And what do you want us to be taken care of in our old age by some moron who will wait for my pension?" Cynthia shook her head. "You shouldn't say that. I don't think that's true. Children don't inherit the traits of their biological parents, especially if they are taken from an orphanage right after birth." Kevin looked at her as if she'd said something stupid. "Of course, it's easy for you to judge from the outside. I have a business to run, and I need a proper heir. And who do you suggest I take an alcoholic, a vagrant? How can I give him my business, which I've been developing for so many years?" Kevin was indignant. Cynthia blushed to the roots of her hair. "Honey, did you ever think that your son might grow up to be even more successful than you? Become an asset to the business? Maybe even more successful than you and me combined," she suggested. Kevin pressed his lips together resentfully. The notion that some foster child might be better than he was offended him to the core. No, it wouldn't be like that. All those foster kids would be just as much losers as their parents. The parents will drink, party, spend money, and then go to jail. They'll come back with tuberculosis. No, I don't want that kind of pleasure for nothing. He cut him off. Perhaps if her mother-in-law had not been on her husband's side, Cynthia might have persuaded him to take the baby from the orphanage. But since Mrs. Kimberly was also against it, Cynthia's chances were practically nil. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, took real aesthetic pleasure in hurting Cynthia time after time by talking about the children. she would suddenly begin to speculate aloud about what kind of nursery she would like for her grandchildren, or she would talk about the beautiful pram her friends' grandchildren had, and also that she would like to give her grandchildren to the 10th kindergarten, and not to the 3rd. Cynthia was pulled out of a state of sad reflection by someone's quiet, ingratiating voice. "Auntie, I suppose you like to feed the birds?" Cynthia turned round and saw a girl of about 7 behind her, wearing a dress 2 sizes too big and old, worn-out sandals. "Yeah, do you want to join us? Come on, let's go. We'll feed the birds and then the squirrel." "Do you know how funny they are?" replied Cynthia. The little girl suddenly tensed up and looked round, then looked again at the 2 buns that Cynthia had thoughtfully bought for the birds. Little Elizabeth looked at Cynthia in such a way that she felt uneasy. There was too much longing in the eyes of this girl who stood in the park and looked at the treats with hungry eyes. "Would you like me to buy you a bun?" Cynthia asked slowly and cautiously. The little stranger nodded happily. "Of course. But I'd like to have 2 buns. For my brother, he's staying with his grandmother." "I went to look for something to eat," the girl replied. "My grandmother is sick and my parents are dead. Sometimes I work in the park, though my grandmother swears. But what can I do? Do you want? I can dance or recite a poem." Cynthia's heart ached for the little girl. "Oh, really? Come on, just take it for free. Do you want me to go to the shop and buy your brother whatever you want? I'll get you some juice. What are you going to eat? If not, let's go to a cafe and have a proper meal," she suggested. "What's your name anyway?" "I'm Cynthia. You can just call me Aunt Cynthia." The girl paused, as if gathering her strength and thinking whether to tell this strange woman her name or not. At last the little girl said, "And I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Harris. We live near here, in the old annex. We used to have a big house, but it burned down and the firemen were able to save the outhouse. My grandmother and I live there, and we've recently had a baby brother." Cynthia looked at the little girl in surprise. "A baby brother? You said your parents died. He must be little. What is he, a year old?" Elizabeth smiled and took a bun from Cynthia's hands and took a bite. "No, little brother's almost as old as me. He's 8 years old. His name is Bruce. He's a new arrival, but his grandmother took him in. What's he going to do? Wander the streets on his own? It's nice and cozy in our annex. It's not hot in summer, warm in winter, and the stove burns so hot that I even sleep without a blanket. True, we have to prepare firewood from summer, but we manage," the girl continued. Cynthia found the girl's story strange. She was even more alarmed by the boy's name, Bruce. Wasn't he the same Bruce who had disappeared because of Johnny the Tramp? Cynthia wanted to ask the question directly, but then decided to proceed more cautiously. After all, she was talking to a small child who could be frightened or traumatized by an awkward word. There weren't many street kids in town with the name Bruce. Maybe it's a different kid who has taken up with her granddaughter's grandmother in search of sustenance. "What's your grandmother's name, Elizabeth?" Cynthia asked cautiously. "Mrs. Amanda," the girl answered readily. Cynthia smiled. "Can I speak to your grandmother? Don't be afraid. I won't do anything bad to you. I'll just buy some groceries and bring them home to you. And if necessary, I'll go get some medicine for your grandma. I'm actually a doctor." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "What did you say? You're a doctor? Wow. Then of course let's go to Grandma's house. See if you can give her some advice or give her the right medicine. She's treating herself. You know, she has these little ulcers on her legs. If you don't treat them, they get bigger. I don't even know what it's called." Cynthia shook her head sadly. "It's probably trophic ulcers. They often haunt the elderly. I understand. If necessary, I'll write the right prescription and prescribe treatment. I'm actually a surgeon. but I think in your grandmother's case it might be possible to do without surgery, Cynthia said. Elizabeth listened carefully, as if she understood every word. Cynthia went to the shop and bought a huge bag of groceries before going to the house. Like any smart, thrifty woman, she took everything she needed to make a proper lunch, dinner, and breakfast. As it turned out, Elizabeth really lived not far from the city park and the place where it smoothly passed into the private sector, where several dozen houses, similar to each other as twin brothers, were cosily settled. However, the annex, in which the grandmother and granddaughter lived, stood out even against the background of all the other buildings because it was very small, and of course old and in need of repair. Cynthia realized this as soon as she approached the gate. The roof had rotted away and was covered with old slate, which was probably also leaking and letting in moisture. The panes of glass were dirty and in places covered with cracks that had been covered with sticky tape for safety. The squeaky door was creaking, and Cynthia thought it might as well not be closed at all, especially in the summertime. There was nothing to steal from the house, and it was unlikely that any burglars would attempt this inconspicuous outbuilding. As soon as she stepped through the door, Cynthia could smell the strong odor of medicine. Like any medical man, she considered them an indispensable part of her life. Letting Elizabeth go, Cynthia followed with the bag of groceries. The little girl took a few timid steps and then said, "Grandma, hello. I brought you a doctor. She is a surgeon. She knows how to treat your illness." For a moment, there was a tense pause in the room. Then someone's tired, elderly voice answered, "Thank you. Is it convenient for her to come to our house? This isn't the right place at all. Oh, it's embarrassing." Cynthia smiled and immediately hastened to defuse the situation. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Amanda. I'm a doctor. I don't care about your surroundings and the fact that there are no repairs. That's not what I'm interested in. Let me examine you and tell you what can be done and what medication to prescribe. You may even have to take a course of medication," said Cynthia. Mrs. Amanda looked at her guest doubtfully. "Well, I don't know. I've been on my own for a long time. I can't walk to the hospital. We don't have a car either. And there's no one to take care of me but Elizabeth." But Cynthia nodded and looked pityingly at the old woman. Of course, she knew how hard it was for her to be alone with her little granddaughter. Now they had a little homeless child with them. If Mrs. Amanda had a daughter or a son, they would have taken her to the hospital and seen a doctor. And so she could only rely on herself and on the help of her underage granddaughter, who needs to go to school, not wander around the park and beg. "All right, let's get to the examination. Where can I wash my hands?" Cynthia asked businesslike. The old woman hesitated for a moment and then asked Elizabeth to show her the bathroom. On her way to it, Cynthia caught a glimpse of the boy in the next room, who was huddled in a corner, clearly afraid of her presence. This fact was extremely alarming. There was something wrong with this, no matter how she looked at it. Usually street children do not behave like this, because the street promotes the development of courage and inconsideration in them, which gives them the right to beg and ask people for anything they want. This boy seemed quiet and a little scared. And he was also clearly wary of Cynthia, who in his mind was a danger in his own home. Cynthia proceeded to inspect, of course, aware that Mrs. Amanda's legs had probably already developed trophic ulcers. Nevertheless, what she saw shocked her even as an experienced medical surgeon. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Mrs. Amanda was unable to buy expensive medicines. So she used the ones that were absolutely useless in her situation. Not only that, but she was self-medicating, which in itself is very dangerous. "You know, Mrs. Amanda, I'd advise you to go to hospital. I'll prescribe the right medication and ointments, but you may need a blood test along with a whole range of other tests. These will help to determine the true picture of the illness," Cynthia began. Mrs. Amanda looked longingly at her guest. "I'm sorry, but how do you envisage it? Who's going to take me? You'd have to hire a taxi to get to the hospital. And you know what they're charging these days? My pension is small. I've been a cook for almost 30 years. I'm always on my feet, so I earned it. I'd keep working. I can't stand anymore, and I can't find a sedentary job. Let me tell you about the accident that killed my kids. They just bought a second-hand car. They had been saving up for it for several years, and then they took to the motorway and went to a neighboring town for a visit. A drunk driver drove into oncoming traffic. It was a no-win situation. It's a good thing Elizabeth was with me, or I wouldn't be alive right now. I'd have someone to take care of me. Elizabeth and that boy are the only ones left. At the mention of the boy, Cynthia shuddered. Perhaps this was a chance to make inquiries about him, but it must be done as quietly as possible so he wouldn't hear. Look, Mrs. Amanda, do you know Bruce's surname or how you came to have him in the first place? Mrs. Amanda looked anxiously at Cynthia. Look, isn't he the reason you're here? Maybe you're not a doctor at all. If you want Bruce to have him, I'm not giving him to anyone. Johnny brought him to me because he said he needed help. And I've known Johnny a long time. He's a good man. He wouldn't do anything bad to us. He told me the boy needed help. So he did. I remember Johnny when he was a teenager. He used to come into my canteen for a snack. He was like a son. But then he got mixed up with a bad crowd, went to jail, did some time, but then he got his head on straight. Except Johnny's stepdad drank up Johnny's flat. That's how he ended up on the street. At the mention of the boy, Cynthia turned pale. At that moment, she realized that Johnny didn't really mean to hurt anyone, but had other aims. Immediately, a rather slender picture began to form in her mind of what might have really happened. For some reason, guessing that little Bruce needed help, Johnny had decided to hide him at his acquaintance's house, and then he was the victim of a robbery that nearly cost him his life. Mrs. Amanda, don't even think about it. I don't want to take anyone away from you. It's just that I operated on Johnny tonight. He's been stabbed in the stomach, you know, and they're accusing him of kidnapping Bruce. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk to the boy and find out what happened, Cynthia said, hardly able to contain her excitement. Mrs. Amanda turned pale. Of course, dear, talk. My God, what's happened to my neighbor? He was like a son to me. Who'd lay a hand on him? He's so kind by nature he wouldn't hurt a fly. And then he gets a knife in the stomach. Cynthia, seeing the worry in the old woman's eyes, hastened to reassure her. No, don't worry, he'll live. I'm sure the operation was a success, although it was hard around 4 in the morning. I came straight from the night shift to see you today. I was sacked for that case, but don't worry, I'll write your prescriptions without all that red tape. You know what I mean? You are treated not with the medicines you have at home now, but with the ones you need in your case. You're making things worse for yourself. And if this keeps going on, it could come to, I don't even want to talk about it. I mean, amputation, you know? Mrs. Amanda had tears in her eyes. Unfortunately, like many elderly people, she was afraid to go to the doctor and decided to treat herself. Leaving her grandmother with her grandson for a while, Cynthia left the room and approached a frightened Bruce. My name is Cynthia. And you're Bruce, aren't you? The boy nodded timidly and looked at her with the look of a hunted wolf cub. Realizing that he was unlikely to say anything, Cynthia continued the conversation. Bruce, I'm sorry to ask you this directly, but Uncle Johnny, who helped you, didn't kidnap you, did he? At the mention of Johnny, Bruce's eyes flashed with joy. No, not at all. Of course he didn't kidnap me. He and I were just hanging out, and Uncle Johnny was always helping. Once he brought a squirrel to my house and showed it through the window, and carved toys out of wood, and little things like that. Anyway, he kept me entertained. Cynthia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Entertained you? Why couldn't you go and entertain yourself? And why did he keep pointing out the window? Bruce gloomed. Well, how can I tell you? My stepfather wouldn't let me go outside. I stayed home all day long. All I could do was open the window a little bit to get some fresh air and see what was going on outside. That's when I met Uncle Johnny. He often went about his business and I waved at him. One wave at first, and then we started greeting each other. And one day I managed to open the window more than usual, and I talked to him. The boy's rambling story brought tears to Cynthia's eyes. She had expected to hear anything but this. The boy had been held hostage by his stepfather, who kept him locked up like a golden cage. Bruce, why didn't your stepfather let you go outside? Were you misbehaving? Cynthia asked cautiously. The boy shook his head resolutely. No, I was behaving well. I even went to school. And then my stepfather suddenly decided that I shouldn't be shown to people, locked me up at home, and arranged with the school principal for me to study remotely. When I didn't do well, I had a tutor come to me. Actually, Uncle Jonathan is not my real father, he's my stepfather. You see, his aunt comes to him all the time. She doesn't like me and locks me in a room when they meet, drinks wine, watches TV, and I have to sit quiet as a mouse and not make any noise. At that moment, Cynthia felt uneasy. Just the thought of Bruce having fun with some girl and his adopted son sitting around waiting for it to be over made Cynthia uncomfortable. She thought for a moment, then asked, Bruce, can you tell anyone else about this if you need to? You know, like the police or the courts? The boy looked at her eagerly. Of course I can. I'd just like to see Uncle Johnny because we came here and then he disappeared. Cynthia frowned, not knowing whether to tell the truth or not, but then, weighing up the pros and cons, she told him what had really happened. A tear immediately rolled down Bruce's cheek. Will he live? Aunt Cynthia? Uncle Johnny, he's a good man, he can't die. She smiled. Of course, I promise. There are different cases, of course, but of this I am 100% sure. Your Uncle Johnny is a real fighter. He's got a grip on life like no other. So you can be proud of him, and I can be proud of you. But now I guess I'd better get going. I have to go to the pharmacy and get some medicine for your grandmother, and then I'll be back. You stay here, don't go anywhere. You've got enough groceries for now. I'm going to try and deal with your stepfather. At the mention of him, Bruce suddenly turned pale and looked anxiously at his guest. Maybe you shouldn't. Or at least be careful, okay? What's wrong with him? Cynthia asked in surprise. Bruce hesitated for a moment, but then said, He's not a good man. When my mom got sick, Uncle Jonathan wouldn't let her go to the doctor, brought him home. In fact, I don't think he was a doctor, he was a gangster. He had blue tattoos on his arms. You know, you don't, but he did. Cynthia tried to keep her cool. She nodded demurely. To tell the truth, she wanted to make a scene with Mr. Jonathan, who pretended to be a prominent businessman, but was in fact a common criminal. And her husband Kevin was a good man, too, finding himself such a companion. I can't tell you. Warning Mrs. Amanda that she was going to the pharmacy, Cynthia left the house and breathed in the fresh air. After the stuffy atmosphere of the dark outbuilding, the street seemed to her a paradisiacal place. Entering the pharmacy, she recalled from memory the list of medicines she needed for her treatment. It should be said that all the drugs from this group were freely available. That is, did not require a prescription. But for some reason, the pharmacist refused to give her the medicine. They are freely available, Cynthia objected. I'm a doctor, so I'm the one who made the prescription. If you doubt me, I work at a private clinic called Avicenna. Well, I should say I used to work at Avicenna, she mumbled embarrassedly, thinking, and then decided to call the pharmacy manager. For a moment, Cynthia felt that a scandal was unlikely to be avoided. The superintendent turned out to be a woman in her 40s. Her fingers were covered with rings, and around her neck she wore a braided chain with a massive heart-shaped pendant. "Is there a problem?" the superintendent asked. Cynthia was convinced that this was going to be a confrontational conversation. "Yes, I want to buy these medicines, and they won't let me have them," she said. The manager frowned. "They won't release them, you say? You should know that you need a prescription to buy such drugs." So the employee is absolutely right. And if you don't have a prescription, you can go to another pharmacy. Cynthia's lips trembled. "Look, you must have misunderstood something. I am a doctor and I know what medicines are on the market. Mrs. Amanda needs them for her tropical ulcers from an allergic reaction. And you're stalling and stalling instead of giving us a chance to cure this woman," Cynthia said with annoyance. "My name is Cynthia, and I'm a doctor, a surgeon at the Avicenna private clinic. You may have heard of it?" Emily shook her head doubtfully. Then she thought about it, picked up the phone, and decided to call Mr. Miles, the doctor. Cynthia waited nervously. In the meantime, the superintendent was already talking to the chief physician, and as her face changed, Cynthia realized that she was likely to be denied her medication. Unfortunately, her premonition had not deceived her. Finished speaking, Emily forcefully put down the receiver of the machine. Then she walked over to Cynthia and said, with emphasized contempt, "Look, you're an ex-doctor, so I don't need to be the one who's trying to push my way in here. If you don't like it, nobody's keeping you here, and if you resent it, I'll call security. You're just pretending to be a doctor. She's a doctor. How come you got fired? And what's more, you're facing a criminal offense. And you want to drag me down with you? No, sweetheart, you go back to where you came from. You'll get no help from me." Cynthia's eyes welled up with tears from the offense. What's that supposed to mean? She can't buy medicine anymore. She slammed the door in her face and went to the next pharmacy, which was a few hundred meters away. There she was sold the medicine without any problems. However, her mood was already hopelessly ruined. She wanted to do the best to help an elderly person, but it turned out quite the opposite. On the way back, the telephone in her purse rang. Cynthia wondered who it could be. She picked up the receiver and heard the familiar voice of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly. "Hello, Cynthia. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you from work for an hour. I bought some cleaning products. I thought I'd clean the windows today and maybe the floors. Your place is such a mess, and you're nowhere to be found. I called Kevin. He doesn't know anything. You've been a little too free lately. You're not out there, are you? 'Cause I've seen a lot of you doctors in my time. I know what you do on your night shifts." And that was the last straw for Cynthia. "What night watch? What are you getting at, Mrs. Kimberly? Don't you know what happened today?" She was outraged. "I operated on a patient at 4 a.m. who came into the clinic with a stab wound to the abdomen. And you're accusing me of infidelity?" "Yes, if you have any doubts, you can inquire at the registrar's office, or even call the head doctor himself. He'll tell you what really happened." Mrs. Kimberly realized she'd overstepped her bounds. However, her mother-in-law was never very good at apologizing, so she decided that the best defense was attack. "Don't raise your voice at me. I'm not your maid. If I said I'm coming today, then be ready and wait for me. Like I have to clean your windows, your fridge is a mess. Don't you have time to cook something? Kevin's going to get an ulcer from an empty stomach." Cynthia just burst into flames. "No, Mrs. Kimberly, your Kevin won't get an ulcer," she said. "He only eats at restaurants. He doesn't eat much at home. He comes home at midnight. I've cooked for him a few times, but nobody eats but me. You know, it's not very nice to work all night and then sit alone waiting for your husband to come home." But Mrs. Kimberly couldn't be persuaded. As mothers-in-law often do, it's always the son-in-law who's closest. And no matter what the daughter-in-law did, it was useless. It felt like she was about to explode with anger. Cynthia interrupted the call and put the phone away in her purse. Once again, her mother-in-law had done everything she could to humiliate her, once again to assert herself at someone else's expense. Of course, Cynthia didn't know that Mrs. Kimberly was actually jealous of her. After all, her sister-in-law had been to medical school. Mrs. Kimberly had a technical degree and a job as a seamstress in a factory. However, she worked there for a short time and left the place when the country was gripped by the thirst for commerce and business. She divorced when Kevin was 2 years old, and the reason for the divorce was that the father of her child was paid too little. Mrs. Kimberly, on the other hand, would only settle for $1 million she had never seen in her life. Is it any wonder that Kevin grew up to be so greedy and unscrupulous about running a business? After all, we can only guess what his mother had to go through in order to accumulate the initial capital, which the son then led in the development of his own business. Back at Mrs. Amanda's, Cynthia set about dressing and treating the wounds on the sick woman's legs. Of course, a nurse on the ward would do this, but as Cynthia was now alone, she had no other choice. "Cynthia, thank you so much. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't know what to do. I can see it's bad, but I haven't told Elizabeth about it so as not to frighten her. I don't want the girl to cry and be afraid I'll be gone," grandmother said with feeling. Cynthia smiled and replied quietly, "Don't worry, Mrs. Amanda, everything will be all right. The medicine will kick in now and you'll feel better. But it's too soon. Remember my words, you will dance at your granddaughter's wedding," she said. After treating the wounds on her legs, Cynthia went to Bruce's room to have another heart-to-heart talk with him. Approaching the boy, she asked, "Bruce, you do realize that if we have to contest the guardianship, Uncle Jonathan will have to give the necessary testimony, don't you?" He looked at her sadly. "Yes, I understand. But tell me, would that really help? Because I don't want to go home. My stepfather will lock me in the basement for what happened. Or worse, he'll call a guard. Uncle Johnny helped me that time. He broke the bars so I could climb out the window. And then we went for a walk together. We went to the park. It was Uncle Johnny who brought me here and said he'd be back soon." At this point, Cynthia suddenly realized that perhaps Johnny could have been hurt by Mr. Jonathan's helpers. After all, if he was connected with crime, what would it take for him to set people up to give the tramp a good beating? Deciding to consult her husband first, Cynthia called to ask how the investigation into Johnny was going. Kevin didn't answer right away. There was a clear irritation in his voice, which was due to the fact that he clearly did not want to talk to Cynthia. "Look, what do you want? You're worried about your tramp. He's alive and well in the prison hospital. He'll get a little sneeze, and then he'll be ready for questioning. I'm sure he'll crack," Kevin said. "It wasn't his fault. I know that for a fact," Cynthia said carefully. Her husband chuckled. "You know, I wonder how you know all this. Are you in bed with him? Maybe he whispered something to you the night you operated on him." Cynthia wrinkled her nose. "No, he didn't whisper anything to me. It's just that you think there's something wrong with the boy. Well, he's fine. And I can say that with confidence to anyone, anywhere." Kevin's voice suddenly sounded suspicious. "Listen, do you know where that boy is? Well, you tell Mr. Jonathan, and he might put you back in the clinic for it. You know he's on good terms with the head doctor. One word from him, and you'll be back in the state. Just tell me, where's that little ragamuffin hiding?" "No, Kevin. I don't think we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to go to the police. And I'd advise your Jonathan to get a good lawyer," Cynthia said. The husband was about to launch into an angry tirade, but he saw that the screen of the smartphone had faded, indicating that she had disconnected the call. "My wife has never done this before. Look how brave she's become. I'll have to tell my mother to rein her in. Look at her. She's completely out of control. She has forgotten who put her in that private clinic for a lot of money, the businessman muttered. Few people knew that in fact Kevin had long been dependent on Mr. Jonathan, who helped him in his business by providing him with some investments to keep him afloat. In return, Kevin had to run all sorts of unpleasant errands. One of these errands was an attempt on the vagrant Johnny, who unwittingly contributed to the escape of his stepson from Jonathan's house. Naturally, Kevin himself did not take part in the attack. He hired people, recently released from prison, to teach the vagrant a lesson. They agreed to do it for a fairly small amount of money. After all, at that time they were in dire need of money. Unfortunately, during the conversation they overreacted, and it came to violence. That's when one of them stabbed Johnny. I guess the conversation didn't work out. Naturally, after the incident, Mr. Jonathan had a big row with Kevin, calling him a fool who couldn't be trusted with anything. Mr. Jonathan was also afraid that Johnny might remember Kevin's helpers and lead the police to them. But Mr. Jonathan controlled his stepson for good reason. He was the main beneficiary of his mother's inheritance. Jonathan had already been a trustee by all the papers, who could not fully dispose of his stepson's money, therefore, and tried to keep the boy in a golden cage, controlling his every move. Of course, Bruce was not a serious danger to Jonathan now, but children grow up fast. What would happen in 5 or 10 years? By then, Jonathan would have raised a dutiful stepson who would give him all his savings when he came of age, and if Bruce grew up to be willful, it would be a complete failure for Jonathan. After talking to her husband, Cynthia was convinced that he was no help, so she decided to spend the night in Mrs. Amanda's outbuilding, and the next morning go to the police. Not alone, but with Bruce, who was to give the necessary evidence while she waited for the morning. The night dragged on like rubber, bringing the inexorable hour of reckoning for Mr. Jonathan and company. What was the surprise of the police when they saw the boy they had been looking for the second day on the doorstep? Bruce smiled sweetly and talked about how he had never been kidnapped. And Uncle Johnny actually helped him. Look, maybe he's lying about all this, the duty officer asked Cynthia. Cynthia smiled enigmatically. I don't know. Can you ask him yourself? I think Bruce is telling the truth. Yes, he is. Uncle Johnny helped me, but my stepfather, Uncle Jonathan, he's really bad. He wouldn't let me go out. So I don't want to go back to him anymore, Bruce said. He also hurt me and probably seems to have poisoned my mum, Bruce stated. The desk clerk shook his head and then called for the head of operations. This is where Cynthia realized she had done the right thing by contacting law enforcement. Soon a special officer was called for the boy, who was able to find a common language with children. And thanks to this, he quite quickly found out from Bruce everything that the investigation needed. On the same day, Mr. Jonathan was arrested. However, the law enforcers did not manage to keep him in custody for long. After all, on the same day the lawyer made a solid bail for him, but this personally Cynthia did not care. After all, she had achieved the most important thing. Now Bruce will no longer live with his stepfather, who faces trial in real term. Having learned about what his wife Cynthia had done, Kevin was really furious. What does she think she's doing? Does she really want to put me in a nunnery? Jonathan would eat me alive for these tricks, he complained to his mother, Mrs. Kimberly. Mrs. Kimberly thought for a moment. Well, if that's the case, son, I think we ought to be on the safe side. You know, you should file for divorce before it's too late. If Jonathan gives you a hard time, you tell him I haven't had a relationship with my wife in a long time. She's not in her right mind, said Mrs. Amanda indignantly. Cynthia hasn't recovered from her dismissal. She does as she pleases. Kevin's eyes twinkled with a sly twinkle. His mother's suggestion certainly appealed to him. And that same day he filed for divorce from Cynthia. Thanks to the testimony of Cynthia and little Bruce, Johnny was cleared of all charges that same day. And homeless Johnny was also transferred to a normal hospital, where he received good care and therapeutic therapy. After Mr. Jonathan's case, the investigation led to the head doctor, Mr. Miles, and the head of the department at the Avicenna Clinic. The couple were now facing criminal penalties that would put an end to their careers as they tried to cover their tracks. Mr. Miles called Cynthia and urged her to come back to work. Except she didn't want to. Instead, she returned to the very city hospital where her career began. There she was able to nurse Johnny, chatting with him about everything in the world. Also, without too much trouble, she was able to arrange with the superintendent for Mrs. Amanda to be placed in one of the wards for intensive therapy. Luckily, this had paid off and her grandmother was slowly on the mend. Cynthia, on the other hand, had a divorce ahead of her, which was arranged by her husband Kevin. The thing was that Kevin decided to leave Cynthia without a house, which was purchased with their joint money. Not only that, in fact, she gave a large sum of money from her own pocket to pay off the mortgage, but Kevin had tactfully kept quiet about it. What was the businessman's surprise when in court he saw next to Cynthia little Bruce and Johnny, who had been discharged from the hospital and was now going to stand up to the end for his saviors. Even a good family law attorney didn't help Kevin that day. In fact, when the boy Bruce told of how and what Cynthia had helped him with, everyone present could not hold back the tears. It was only now that the true extent of Mr. Jonathan and Kevin's scam became clear. Without knowing it himself, the husband had awakened forces that affected not only the boss, but himself as well. Soon all of his associates who had attempted to murder Johnny were apprehended under the pressure of irrefutable evidence. They testified, and Kevin went straight from the courtroom in the divorce case to the detention center. Cynthia, on the other hand, left the court as a winner. Johnny was on her left hand and Bruce on her right. They were met outside by Mrs. Amanda and little Elizabeth, who was holding a bunch of wild flowers. Cynthia smiled and caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had felt as good as she did now. That afternoon they had taken many walks and enjoyed what each other had. They had also talked with Johnny about what day they would choose to have their wedding. In the end, they agreed that they would have the wedding on Bruce's mother's birthday, thus giving the baby a kind of gift. After a noisy celebration, Cynthia and Johnny adopted both Bruce and Elizabeth as guardians. The whole family, along with grandmother Mrs. Amanda, moved into Bruce's mother's house. Johnny took a driving course and got his license and became a taxi driver. Bruce and Elizabeth go to school together.
Marian Morris had long since stopped being dreamy. She had a lot to worry about in this life. Not long ago, her father had left the family, leaving his wife with an invalid mother and 3 minor children alone. The 19-year-old girl was the main helper in this family. Sometimes it even seemed that she had become a substitute for her father. The mother had a quiet, calm character, but she was never affectionate and attentive to her relatives. Especially her indifference lately extended to the elder Marian, whom she more often called Mary, and treated her as if she were a neighbor's girl. Mrs. Kimberly, a mother of many children, had another son aged 11 called Jack and a very young daughter, a preschooler named Cassandra. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Marian was not with Marcus, Kimberly's ex-husband, but with some long-time pal of the woman. Most likely a drinking buddy, she liked to get down to the bottle, just like her husband. But then one day, Marcus had an irreparable event. He suddenly had an epiphany, became more and more interested in newfangled trends for a healthy lifestyle, and attempted various diets. First, Marcus gave up his family's favorite sausage sandwiches in the morning, then all meat dishes. Kimberly began to buy more fish, which her husband had not yet given up, but this did not save their marriage. Marcus then became a raw food eater, and then starved. More and more often, instead of having a glass or two with his wife and friends, he started to go to the forest, walk there for several hours and just enjoy nature. He found adherents on social networks. Almost all of them were men and unmarried. It was interesting for the aspiring vegan to observe the lifestyle of these freedom-loving guys through photos and videos on the internet. And increasingly he was disappearing outside the house, away from his family, his children, his wife, and his sick mother-in-law, with whom his relationship never worked out. I felt life. I had to change something in my destiny. He shared these sentiments with his friends more and more often. And then one day, lying on the sofa after another inspiring walk, Marcus looked at his wife and fussing children and realized he had to leave. As Marcus packed his things, Kimberly just lay motionless in the room. Sometimes it seemed like she was sobbing, but she had found out about her husband's decision a couple of days before he left, had an argument with him, even a bit of a fight, and then just realized there was nothing she could do about it. Marcus put his arm around his son and kissed the still uncomprehending Cassandra, who had been asking him all the way, "Dad, when are you coming?" And her question remained unanswered every time. Then the prodigal father, ready to leave the house with his bags, where a taxi was waiting for him in the street, looked at Marian, who was standing aside. He approached her slowly and said, "Marian, look for yourself." The girl looked at him questioningly. "Look for yourself. Look inside, you have a light. You're going to make it." "Okay," the daughter answered confusedly. This large family was left alone, without a father, without a breadwinner, without a protector. Now both mother, grandmother, and Marian, as the oldest members of the family, began to think more and more often about how to feed the children. Marian had felt lonely almost from childhood. She had friends, some of her classmates stayed in town. Most of them had moved to places more suitable for earning and living. One such friend was Gabrielle Jones. She had known Marian since first grade. They both sat in the fan seats at the outdoor stadium, where town sporting events were often held. Marian decided to tell her friend about the recent changes in their family. "So anyway, my dad left my family." "Really?" Gabrielle put both hands on her head, trying to act dramatic. "Yeah, he just left. Packed his things, said goodbye, said some rubbish to me." "What kind of stuff?" "Yeah, it was bullshit." Marian smirked. "Look for the fire inside," said the girl. Gabrielle laughed out loud, followed by the storyteller. They were both rolling on the floor with laughter. But then, calmed down, Marian went on again. "Yes, he's been strange lately. To tell you the truth, I didn't feel sorry for him." "Strange? What do you mean?" "Going into the woods, not eating meat, and all that." "Yeah." And anyway, Marian looked away and smiled faintly. She took out a packet of cigarettes. "What?" "What? Say what you want to say." "I don't even know." It was obvious that Marian hesitated to tell her, or to keep secret what lurked in her soul. She didn't know whether to tell even her best and time-honored friend at such moments. "Marian, we've known each other so long. Maybe I'm worried." Gabrielle bought her friend a smoke and she gave in. "Yeah, they say he's not my father. I don't know whether to believe it or not." "That's weird, who's saying that?" "Mrs. Cheryl from up the street, Mom and Dad's friends. I haven't heard it myself, but it's all come to me recently. It's so annoying to be told you've heard it somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about it now." "Yes," said Gabrielle thoughtfully. All evening and all night, Marian worried about her decision to tell her friend about the rumor, for even she did not know if it was true. Marian had worked before her father and family left, but it was more of a part-time job than a full-time job. She handed out leaflets. She was a sales consultant in a clothing shop. She traveled with goods to various addresses in the city as a courier. Now it had been decided by the family council that Marian would go to New York to work. Kimberly had already managed to call her sister, who worked in one of the grocery shops of a large chain in the city. Catherine was a receptionist and had once long ago offered Kimberly a job at an open sales position. Kimberly had been taking care of the younger Cassandra at the time, and Marian couldn't sit with her since she was already moonlighting somewhere. When Marcus left, she remembered her sister's offer. It was Marian's first day of work. She was to come to the shop and talk to Mrs. Catherine and listen to a short lecture on her job description. Marian took her packing seriously. She put on dark trousers and her best, almost unworn jumper. Her mother saw her fiddling in the mirror and putting on her makeup. "Why are you going to be a shop assistant?" she said squeamishly and almost indifferently, standing on the threshold of her daughter's room. Marian made no reply. She had long ago reduced her intercourse with her mother to a minimum and spoke to her only on business. She loved her, of course, but it was easier this way. Marian had long felt that her mother's attitude to her was mainly consumerist, and she did not want to be personally convinced of it. This woman seldom cared for the girl's personal problems. Her name had long been associated in this family with the words, help, do, and fetch. It was a long drive from small town to big New York City, where Marion had only been a couple of times in her entire 19-year-old life. She was riding on the bus and listening to her favorite music on the player, looking around at the surrounding farms and small towns along the way. Suddenly, she felt sad. The girl thought about her life in her childhood. It turns out I hardly had one. She remembered quite the early years when there were 3 of them. Her mother and father. They had been younger, funnier, and friendlier then. Her mother would hug her at times, kiss her forehead, and her father would joke merrily, tossing his little girl in the air. Father and mother drank less, they were lively, but then brother Jack was born and relations in the family, for some reason, deteriorated. Marion was only 8, and she already had to almost run from school to sit with the baby. From then on, the girl began to feel that she was no longer perceived as before, as a daughter, as a girl, as a living person who had a beating heart inside. More and more often she began to hear, "You must, don't forget," and other words containing requests, if not orders. And less often she received words of approval, care, and love. When Cassandra was born, Marion realized that she was certainly not going to have a carefree life now, and she was right. Jack went to school, and Kimberly had her 3rd child. Marcus began drinking more and participating less in the family's life. His wife, who had many children, soon had to look for work, as he quit his job and started looking for work himself. These searches were passive, and every time he was asked about his progress, he sadly replied that there were no suitable vacancies yet, that the salary at the interview was lower than the stated salary. There were many other reasons why he couldn't get a job at his working age, being a fit and healthy man. Kimberly understood that he had no desire to get up every weekday from his favorite sofa and deny himself daily drinks with friends and watching humorous TV shows and series about the police. But what was to be done? Her husband's temper was sometimes harsh, and he could, even when he was in a depressed mood, use his hands, but not against the children. All in all, Kimberly knew she shouldn't have disturbed him. She had also hoped that he would be involved with the kids, but that wasn't happening either. You did your homework and clean up after yourself. That was usually the extent of her father's attention. During this period, Kimberly began to look more and more closely at her eldest. She was already 14 years old when Cassandra was born. One day she told the girl bluntly, "I'm working, money is tight. You need to get a job too." Marion was a serious child, and after a month she started bringing in a small income for the family. She barely had enough for her own needs. She gave almost everything to her mother. Once Marion dared to ask her why her father did nothing, and then she regretted it for a long time. So many negative words and emotions in her direction she had never heard before, became very offended. And at that moment, everything changed in her soul. If her mother did not become her enemy, then her attitude to her, seemingly to the most dear person, became indifferent. Soon Kimberly noticed this change in her daughter, and instead of discussing with her the reason for her reticence, she began to respond in the same way. They were both bound together only by their concern for Jack and Cassandra. Marion became a second mother to these children. Kimberly was not only absent from work, sometimes she arrived very late, and no one knew what the real reason for her delays was. The sick grandmother was out of the picture in this family, and in that she and Marion were alike. She lay in her room and occasionally chatted with her grandchildren. There were medicines lying everywhere, and there was almost always a television on. Marion liked to share some of her less than obvious experiences with her, but as time went on, her grandmother began to feel worse and worse. She was in the hospital or just sleeping. Her grandchildren visited her less and less. On her face one day appeared an expression of indifference to life. All these moments of her life replayed in her head mysterious black-browed girl sitting on the last row in the bus, and sometimes her eyes filled with tears. Well, at least we'll have more money, so she comforted herself at the end of her heavy thoughts. Soon the announcement was made. New York terminus. Marion sighed. She wanted to ride in this old bus, to look at the trees at home and just think, dreaming of a better life that might never come. Marion got off the bus and slowly made her way towards the city center. The stop was located on the very outskirts of town. She saw a few older houses. They were located on an elevated area. The further she traveled towards the shop, the more modern scenery she encountered. Finally, she saw a large grocery shop. It was beautiful, all glass and with glowing letters on the roof. It was a very huge building. Marion walked inside the premises. There was an escalator running right in front of the entrance. On the ground floor, there were little stalls with balloons, with unusual lollipops and different bling. And all this colorful picture briefly caught the eye of a girl from a small town, who did not often come to such crowded places. First, she wanted to buy a beautiful knitted bracelet with stones. Then she looked long and fascinated at the golden statue of a dragon. "I'd like to take one of these home," Marion dreamed. After about 10 minutes of excitement, she remembered that she had not come to go shopping, but to get a job in a grocery shop. But where was it? So it's a shopping center, I guess, she thought. The signs said the grocery shop was on the first floor. At the shop, Aunt Catherine met her niece and immediately started telling her about the duties. There were a lot of them, and one had to listen carefully. Marion knew that Catherine didn't like to repeat herself and took her personality very seriously. Perhaps that was why she and Kimberly didn't get along very well. Her sister in conversation could take offense at nothing, but seriously. Marion was issued a uniform. She was assigned a mentor, a petite blonde woman of about 45 named Selena. She spoke quietly and quickly, sometimes even slurring her words. The girl's first day as a trainee was hectic but unnoticeable. With her anxious thoughts and running after Selena, Marion didn't notice how her shift ended. 9 p.m. "You can pack up." Her mentor walked up to her. "What about you?" "Me too. Let's go to the back room and change there." "Did I work well?" Marion asked. "Yes, you've been fine." It's hard to tell from the first day. Marion calmed down. For some reason, she thought she had made a lot of obvious mistakes, but it turned out that her mentor did not notice anything, or considered all her faults as insignificant. Either way, she was glad for the end of the day, even though no one had praised her. The main thing was that she hadn't messed anything up. So a month passed, and Marion received her first salary, as well as her new position as a sales consultant. The probationary period past this event was the main success she had had recently. One day she came home and found her mother at home, peacefully making soup in the kitchen. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to share her achievement at work with her. She went into the kitchen, and she and her mother exchanged a few words. "No, I won't," Marion thought. "She's all about the money, and that's all that matters." Soon Marion had established herself in her position at the shop. She did her job splendidly and had no complaints about life. She was given a pay rise and once even made Employee of the Month. She was now used to sharing her successes only with herself. Her friend Gabrielle got married and moved in with her husband in Chicago. At times, Marion thought of her and even envied her happiness a little. Yet on the whole, she was content with what she had. The girl had become truly independent. And it was not only about financial independence, because now she could afford to spend more on herself. In addition to all this, she changed personally. She didn't need company at all. She didn't want to talk or listen to anyone. She worked and helped her mother with her children. It would seem that what else was needed for her? A person who had long been deprived of any ambitions. And yet she wanted to love. Marion tried to get into relationships with guys, but after a few short attempts she realized that she didn't want to be with just anyone to have fun and arrange romantic evenings. All these young people were not in a hurry to be serious about Marion. "You're a little too outspoken." Gabrielle had hinted to her in the days when they still lived in the same town. "You're a bit, I'm sorry, not feminine, are you?" she once said. Marion tried to hide the feeling of offense, but she had a great complex in her heart. She was indeed a little coarse, her voice was low, her features, though beautiful, were in many ways boyish, her nose with a hump, her slightly extended manly lower jaw, and her eyes, those brown, thoughtful eyes, in which something deep, secret, and serious was read. It had been 2 years since Marion had taken a job with Aunt Catherine. She was 21 years old and in love. Stephen Howard worked as an area manager for a shopping center and occasionally went into the shop to check on the quality of the staff. He took a fancy to an unusual black-browed girl, and she took a fancy to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His expression always conveyed good-naturedness, and the high-browed, bony blonde named Stephen was liked by all the cashiers and saleswomen in the shop, and they were not shy about exchanging a few enthusiastic words among themselves after he left. Stephen had come on board later than Marion had started working here. For 6 months they exchanged glances, but one day Stephen did get bold enough to make the first move. She was standing at the meat counter. The shop was unusually small and the clerk had nothing to do. It was the right moment for the two of them. She heard behind her, "Girl, why are we standing there? Why are we not working?" It was funny that Marion, who was tired of working days from domestic cares with her brother and sister, at first reacted to the manager's remark sharply and negatively. She turned round and stared at the man with her deep and intense gaze, squinting her thick, dark eyebrows. "I work when there's work to be done. Are all the shelves filled with merchandise? Customers don't need counseling? Is the warehouse in order?" In a monotonous and slightly raised tone, Stephen bombarded the young saleswoman with work-related questions. She stood in silence for a few seconds, not taking her stern gaze off the man, of course, realizing that she would be in trouble if she continued to be rude. It was obvious that she was facing a representative of the management. However, being in a bad mood and hurt by the phrase about idleness in her address, as well as unpleasant questions that sounded like complaints, she could not keep her discontent to herself. "I've worked here for 2 years and no one has ever complained about me. If you want to be the first to do so, be my guest." Marion had that unpleasant quality from childhood. She sometimes could not hold back her sudden anger. She'd had a couple of fights at school, the so-called shooters. There were also attacks of uncontrolled aggression, but all these moments were rare because at home reigned complete indifference. And it would be strange to behave in such a way when neither mother nor father even asked you questions about your affairs, not to mention serious conversations about studies, personal life, or smoking. Standing in front of a shop management representative. For the first time in years, Marion remembered her peculiarity. Her face was covered with color, her eyes glistened, and in her soul there was both dislike and fear for her position, without which she had not seen a full life for herself and her family for a long time. Everything hung on this fragile girl. Suddenly, the stern expression on Stephen's face changed to one of mortification and contentment. He looked at the name on her badge and said in a good-natured tone, as if afraid of her hurt feelings, "Marion, I don't know your patronymic, but I can see that you are a man of character, and I hope you have a good sense of duty. A man like you should be. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I am here to make our business grow and become as profitable as possible." Marion made no reply, but felt as if the manager still had something to say. She was not mistaken. And he continued after a short pause. "How do you get on here?" "I can't complain," she mumbled. She wanted to go to the warehouse, but sensing that the beautiful and daring and even more beautiful girl wanted to leave, Stephen decided to act immediately. He had already spent 6 months looking for her casually through the stalls. "Marion, let me give you my number, so you can be my assistant and keep me informed of how things are going in the warehouse." Marion smirked. She had calmed down a bit, and instead of irritation there was curiosity. "What do you want me to do? Rat out my colleagues?" "I'm sorry, doing what?" Stephen smiled just as amiably. "Marion, I'm just collecting employee numbers. But they're on the database, if anything." The manager was not angry with Marion. On the contrary, he found her a very interesting person, and all her mockery, inappropriate grimaces, like a lack of etiquette when talking to the bosses, only made him angry. He wanted to know more about the girl. "All right, in base, so in base I'll write to you, go to the warehouse." Marion went away. She was filled with one great and vivid feeling. No, it was not anger. It was love at its most embryonic stage, when we are not yet sure of our feelings, and are ashamed of ourselves, ashamed of our thoughts about the person, for we know nothing about him. The same thing was happening to Marion when she just stood in the warehouse by the boxes and did not move, because her new thoughts prevented her from concentrating. "Manager, what did he want from me?" Bullshit. After a peculiar interaction with the new employee, Stephen approached Selena. "Who is this hooligan you have working here?" He smiled at the saleswoman. Morris. Selena sighed. "I think she's Mrs. Catherine's niece. That's all I know." "How's the job?" "We're responsible. Not bad, helpful." "All right, thanks, I'll be off." Stephen left the shop in a pleasant thoughtfulness, and afterwards thought for a long time about the young tall brunette with a serious and beautiful look of big brown eyes. For a long time, neither Marion nor Stephen forced themselves to continue this informal chat. Stephen arrived a couple of weeks later. He didn't write or call her as he had promised. After chatting with the manager, the man in love immediately approached Marion and said in a loud voice, "We need to talk. Please go to the warehouse." There were sales girls and the manager around, still not far away, and the manager did not at all want to be judged by the junior staff here in the future. He was merely pretending that he intended to reprimand the salesgirl. Marian was frightened for a moment, forsook thoughts of the beauty of her lover's eyes and lips, which in a fortnight had bored her, and thought of the dreadful thing, which was the word dismissal. They both walked slowly towards the warehouse. There was no one there, and the only witnesses to Stephen's forthcoming revelations would be the numerous boxes of foodstuffs. "Marian, I'll tell you straight away, no complaints." She looked questioningly at her boss. "I like you here, round and round. I do not want to go round. I want to try to communicate with you." She looked somewhere to the side, down, and smiled sweetly and embarrassedly, as if wanting to answer something. Her lips involuntarily shook, and a slight, but still noticeable to the interlocutor paint, covered all her beautiful face. "Well, you think, here's my number." Marian took from the man a small white card with printed lettering and logo. As he walked away, she examined it. Stephen Howard, business consultant. Below it in even smaller print was a list of his services and his phone number, the most important thing for which this business card had been handed to her. It was a beautiful time, spring. It was around this time that Marian and Stephen began dating. They didn't advertise their relationship. The territorial manager came to the shop as usual, a couple of times a month, and communicated only with those with whom he was supposed to communicate by work. He and Marian even tried not to look at each other. One day during a smoke break, Selena brought up Stephen. There were 3 female shop workers standing outside in a circle. They should have finished their smoke break sooner rather than later, as the shop was left to 2 people, one of whom was a young girl who, just like Marian, had come here a couple of years ago and knew next to nothing. Molly, the cashier, put out her cigarette butt on the rubbish bin and, carefully dropping it there, walked off into the building with a quick step. Selena and Marian took quick puffs to finish their cigarettes and go to their seats. "And are Stephen's all right?" Selena, who was not particularly noted for her participation in gossip, replied cryptically. "Who do you mean, Selena?" Marian asked, though she knew it could only be about the manager. "Stephen Howard." "Yeah, he seems nice." "Marian, are you two dating by any chance?" Selena asked, and the question changed the expression on her colleague's face. "No." "What makes you think that?" "Well, I don't know, it just seemed like an experience." "I don't know what your experience is. You're paying attention to the wrong things," Marian snorted unfriendly. "Maybe not, but just in case he's just not your best option, it's best not to get involved." Marian didn't say anything back to her. She was surprised by her colleague's words. She didn't understand why Selena started to be frank about her boss, and why she was so sure of their connection. The saleswoman wasn't fooling her, though. She had indeed speculated and just guessed that was what was called experience. The quiet, silent worker, who had never been seen discussing colleagues before, suddenly decided to share her suspicions about Stephen with the young employee. Perhaps Selena recognized Marian as herself, and Stephen resembled someone from her past life. The feelings and thoughts that had prompted her to talk remained unknown to Marian. Marian had been her own person for a long time, and she made all her own decisions. She didn't rely on anyone, and she didn't count on anyone. Stephen was a ray of sunshine that had suddenly come into her life. He was a real grown man, capable of courtship, gifts, and displays of affection. Marian had never met a man like him before. All the few partners she'd had were boys, not men, and it wasn't even a matter of age. All they could offer was a trip to a cafe and a sleepover at their house when her parents were away. Stephen, on the other hand, was a wealthy man. He was 30 years old and had already been living alone for several years in his own flat, which he had partly earned himself. His parents were honorable, educated people and wished their son a similarly honorable party. They were both university professors, and many of their students seemed to them good candidates for the role of their son's future wife. But Stephen often referred to the busyness at work and did not come to these nice acquaintances, and if he did, all communication ended with a banal gesture of propriety. He walked the student home and wished her good night. It's not like that. Each time Stephen complained to his parents, begging them to stop these useless acquaintances. His father and mother were genuinely perplexed and asked their son what he wanted. And he only answered, "I'm a grown-up uncle. I'll sort it out myself." So what did the 30-year-old territorial manager of a large grocery chain, Stephen Howard, really want? Firstly, the man was somewhat annoyed by any desire of people, even his closest relatives, to dictate his life. He was used to being the king of his life, and only circumstances that happened to us not of our own free will could change his trajectory. No one in this world was an authority to him, only himself. Some of Stephen's acquaintances called his characteristic overconfidence. And more than once he was advised to listen to the opinions of others, and yet he did things his own way. When he succeeded in his career, he clearly realized that he was on the right path. Strangely enough, he had no clear goal in matters personal. Stephen did not strive, as his parents put it, to find a worthy party, although he was already 30. Perhaps romance lived in this purposeful and pragmatic man. There wasn't much of it, but he, just like his new love Marion, believed that you just had to find your man. It didn't matter to him that his girlfriend hadn't accomplished much in life and worked at the grocery shop in the lowest position. He liked her dark, always, as if on something focused eyes and rough, but at the same time so beautiful and attractive features of the face. Yes, he felt in this difficult, silent girl his own man. Marion had almost ceased to sleep at home. Her mother, of course, was not happy with her, although now their financial situation had improved markedly, and her daughter threw a certain amount of money into her account every month. Since Marion began to date Stephen, the amount became even greater. It was because the young man was giving her money for personal expenses, which meant that the mother was now allowed to throw even more money. Marion understood and didn't argue with her when she spoke. "You have decided to pay us off," she replied. "Yes, you may consider it so," and went to work and then to Stephen's house for the night. Stephen was in no hurry to offer to move Marion into his flat. What was it he couldn't exactly figure it out himself? Perhaps it was some insecurity about his feelings. Or maybe, despite his independence, he was still afraid of his honorable parents and ashamed of the 22-year-old shop assistant who had been his girlfriend for 6 months. In any case, after some time in the soul of this successful man, there was a certain dissonance. He as if began to slowly retreat back. 6 months later came the crisis in this unequal relationship. Marion, tired and broken, came home more and more often to spend the night. Stephen looked for all sorts of excuses not to invite her over. Her mother smirked one day when she saw her daughter on the doorstep late at night. "What, did he leave you?" Marion answered her nothing, by the way. She did not tell her a word about her young man. And so several months passed. Both did not know what to do to end this relationship once and for all, or to continue to meet in the same format, but experienced constant psychological discomfort. They arranged a warm meeting on Valentine's Day. It was a chance to set the record straight, to forgive each other for offenses and deal with misunderstandings and understatements. As luck would have it, Marion got some unpleasant news. One of the saleswomen was sick, and there was no one to work the night shift. "Marion, but I'm begging you to come out. You'll be well paid." The manager begged her. "But I have plans for tonight." Marion replied grudgingly. Probably if the manager had known with whom Marion was going to spend the evenings then, she would certainly have looked for someone else. "I'm begging you. I'll get on my knees." "All right, Bridget, don't. I'll go out." A sense of responsibility had been instilled in her from childhood, not by her mother, not by her father, but by life. And Marion couldn't refuse to help the shop she'd been working in for over a year. Still at the end of her shift, she kept walking around, twisting and turning the phone in her hands, typing and deleting text again. For some reason it seemed to the girl that if she didn't make it, her and Stephen's relationship would be over forever. Yes, she had become a little dependent on him. She liked his advances, the fact that he was a wealthy and mature man, but most importantly, having had no experience of a really serious relationship with men before, Marion quickly got used to him. Somehow she thought that this choice was the best, and she would never get another chance to find a suitable life partner. Stephen was indeed good-looking and well-to-do, but did he love her? She didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in the back of her mind, her heart felt unreciprocated. Finally, it was 9 p.m. The second shift had begun. Marion knew she had to be at Stephen's at 9:30 p.m. She had to dare to text. "I'll write it as it is. He'll think I'm responsible. He's the boss here," Marion tried to reassure herself. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen. One new message. It was Stephen. What was he trying to tell her? Marion opened the message. "Sunshine, please forgive me. I can't make it today. I'll be in an important meeting." How easy and convenient it is, being a member of the administration, to refer to important, usually unscheduled meetings. Stephen had used his position more than once to make up another story about these very important matters, but Marian had no choice but to believe him. After all, if there was no trust, then why keep in touch with the man? She wrote him that she was also busy, that she was put on the night shift, using the warmest and sweetest words. Stephen felt sorry for his girlfriend and wished her a brisk shift. Almost 3 hours passed, there were less and less people in the shop, and thus less work too. Marian was thinking more about her personal problems than about customer requests and groceries. It was unusual for her to work after 9 o'clock, and she was beginning to feel a little drowsy. There was a sudden appearance. Scarlett appeared in the shop, the same sickly shop assistant. Marian was a little puzzled. What was she to do now? "Marian, hi. It's okay, I can do it. I'm free," the woman said. "Yes, but Bridget." I rang. Marian shrugged. She went to the back room to change. She hated to humiliate herself in front of Stephen, but his flat was the only place close to the shop where she could spend the night. She realized he had no intention of seeing her. He might already be asleep or out of the house, but it was still better than catching a taxi in a foreign city past midnight. Maybe he'll at least pay for my taxi, she thought. As it happened, Marian had hardly any money with her, and she certainly wouldn't have enough for the ride home. After 3 messages asking for a bed for the night, or at least for help, Marian began to call Stephen, but all her efforts were in vain. He must have been very busy. She stepped outside, breathed the fresh February air into her chest, and headed for the bus stop. There are times when you know you're doing something reckless, but you walk on, as if you're too lazy to stop, think, and make another, more difficult decision. That's what happened to Marian, who all in her thoughts walked slowly to the bus stop, knowing that all the buses had long since gone away. Marian sat down on the bench once more, checking her phone just in case. It hadn't received a single call, not a single message. Of course, she could have called one of her friends and mates, asked to borrow money and hail a taxi. She could have gone back to the shop and spent the night in the back, but her eyes fell on the very few old houses she had noticed the first time she had come here for a job interview. The houses were old and shabby, but still people lived there. Marian was sure that on the ranch there would be some old man or woman who would be kind enough to shelter her till morning and give her a good meal. At least that's what fairy tales and good films and serials about lost people teach us. She walked towards the houses. A window was burning in one of them. Without thinking long, Marian headed towards the light. She approached the wicket, in the yard of the property through the darkness. The girl saw a large foreign car that looked like an SUV. Though the wicket was closed, the hook could be easily lifted from outside the lot. Marian decided to go in to knock on the door. She reckoned that was what the locals here did. Slowly moving around the lot, she got a little look at the property. There was probably a garden under the windows. There were pegs sticking out from under the snowdrifts that looked like the planks of an ornamental fence. There were fruit trees growing close to the fence. She knocked on the door, and a man soon came knocking. "Who's there?" said a tall male voice. "I missed the bus. I don't know what to do." Well, the man said slyly. He sounded elderly. Marian saw before her a skinny old man a little taller than herself, with a long beard and sparse long hair. He was gray-haired. His thin features did not have a particularly aged look. On the contrary, there was something naive, childlike about them. The old man looked at Marian and smiled. He expected to hear her story. "I didn't catch the bus. I don't know what to do." "Aha, aha." The grandfather said fluently, "I heard that. In short, I don't want to beat around the bush. Can I sleep over?" "Sure, come in, come in." Marian at first became frightened. Crossing the threshold of the house, she felt some hostile aura and even wanted to leave. But the old man turned and said good-naturedly, as if sensing that his manners were not to the liking of the uninvited guest, "We have only good people here, and everybody knows me, and I know everybody. Don't worry, girl. Lie down in a small room and rest until morning." The lively interest in his eyes and sly voice dissolved somewhere, and Marian became easier to communicate with this man. She remembered about the foreign car in the yard. "Do you drive?" My son drives. He comes here with his wife. This time he decided to leave it here. I don't know why." Grandpa went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and from the kitchen I heard something. "Do you want something to eat?" "No, thanks." "Well, at least store-bought cakes with tea." replied the guest. While grandfather was fussing in the kitchen, Marian began to look at his home. It was quite decent. There was a plasma TV on the bedside table, and although the furniture was simple and old-looking, the house was clean and tidy. The sofa was populated with a new bedspread of expensive fabric. It seemed as if someone was constantly caring for this dwelling, and judging by the nature of that care, it was hardly the owner. Yes, my name is Michael Taylor. An elderly man came into the living room with a plate of cakes in his hands. Marian. The girl sighed tiredly. Are you sleepy? I'll get some tea. He left again, and Marian felt her heart finally calm down and beat in a familiar rhythm. Marian ate the cakes and drank tea alone, and the master went away again. He came half an hour later and announced that the room was ready. She had gone to spend the night in a strange place, lying in a strange bed, and this moment, of course, embarrassed her. Lying under the covers, she stared at the burning screen of her phone. Such a strange thing was happening to her. She wanted to share her impressions with at least someone, but then she realized, who should I write to? And having put the phone on the bedside table, she fell asleep in the sound sleep of a baby. Tired and spiritually distressed for the day, Marian decided to get out of bed as soon as her eyes opened for the first time that morning. Despite Michael Taylor's apparent hospitality and kindness, she felt uncomfortable being in someone else's home. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 5:27 a.m. Getting up at this hour was certainly difficult, but still Marian made an effort on herself. If I pack quickly, I can catch the bus, she thought. Marian sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched, slowly so as not to wake the elderly owner of the house. She tucked her phone and charger into her bag, looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall, and opened the door to the living room as carefully as she could. The landlord was apparently asleep. He was lying on the sofa, covered with a plaid, with his back to the exit. A few steps separated the girl from the exit. She paused. Maybe I should thank him. At least say something. No, I won't make the bus. She turned towards the door and continued her slow step. After a few seconds, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It couldn't be anyone else. Marian turned around. A satisfied Michael Taylor stood in front of her with a sly smile that pushed her away, still last night. It wasn't as if the man had just woken up. It was as if he had been invisibly watching his guest since the moment she awoke. Marian became frightened. She was a truly desperate girl at times, and yet she was the weaker sex. And there was a strange man standing in front of her, and this man was clearly not going to let her go. Michael now seemed stronger, taller, and more confident to her. Were these sensations contrived from fear, or had the master, all the time the girl had been in his possession, been trying to appear feeble, bending and grimacing to make Marian believe he was pitying her? She did not know, but it was urgent to get out of this house and not make a mess of things. Darling, where are you going? And who's going to pay for it? He gave his victim a sly look. Look, I'm going to leave now. I have no money, but I'll pay you back. Now I can. Marian began to dig frantically in her bag to find her purse. She pulled it out and took out several 100 notes. Hisham, the old man chuckled softly. Do you have a phone number? I'll text it to you or your son. Here's 400. Put the money away. Breathing heavily, Michael said. The elderly owner abruptly sat down and began to pull off the girl her dark, tight skirt, which she had decided to wear the day before, as February had been warm and sunny lately. Marian immediately began to struggle with the rascal. She tried for his shoulders to push him away from her, but he pressed himself against her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Marian felt as if she were falling. They lay struggling for a while. Michael slapped Marian on the cheek. Shut up and obey, or you'll get in trouble. I'll say you attacked the old man. Marian didn't expect that this man could be so dangerous and strong. She started to scream, and he immediately put his hand over her mouth. Feeling that he had little strength to completely defeat the girl, Michael began to beat her mercilessly on the face, trying to suppress her will, but he did not know that Marian had in her soul so strong an undisclosed anger that only give the will to show itself and terrible things would happen. This anger was like a sleeping bear that had been teased by people. The more they irritate him, the stronger his desire to tear his offenders, and only the cage separates fools from death. Unfortunately for Michael Taylor, a lusty old man, who thought of raping a girl in unpleasant circumstances in the middle of the night, Marian was a warrior in her 22 years. She herself didn't fully know what she was capable of. The blows to her face had pissed her off, and she no longer saw the lonely old man in front of her as a monster and a murderer. Marion bit into his neck, and he loosened his grip a little and groaned. Still, it wasn't working to break free from his tight embrace. Michael continued to beat his victim. At some point, she felt sick to her stomach and decided that this was the end. She was ready for violence to stay alive. Her skirt was almost off. The scumbag was already fumbling with her underwear. Marion could not stand this nightmare. She suddenly screamed so frantically that Michael was just in a daze and finally let her get free. It seemed to run free, call people for help, but this feeling couldn't stop. It was charged and demanded some sort of outlet. Marion, strangely enough, in defiance of the sense of self-preservation she had had until a few minutes ago, took a sharp step towards the kitchen. From there she picked up the heaviest-looking utensil, a cast-iron skillet, and dashed into the room. Before she realized it, Michael was lifting himself up on his hands to get up, but he was still sitting on the floor. He instantly became the victim, not the hunter. Terrified, the old man looked at the furious girl with the frying pan and only had time to open his mouth, probably preparing an exculpatory speech, pitying words to be pitied and spared, but it was not to be. A blow, another blow, and he fell to the floor, sprawled on it senseless. Marion didn't know if her attacker was still alive, but she immediately called an ambulance and the police. She sat at her desk in a small armchair beside the body of her failed rapist and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Thoughts of criminal responsibility began to cross her mind. At 16, when she was still at school, she'd been interested in the law for a while. At home, there was a thick book on the shelves called Legislation. At first, Marion just opened and closed it, and then for fun began to learn by heart the names of articles and their numbers. The number 105 came to mind. Would I get 105 or not? Would I have a chance of not going to jail? This is self-defense. Marion was not sure that she would not be given the article for murder, but she was more inclined to manslaughter. In any case, the girl was scared, because in front of her, perhaps there was a corpse of a man and an elderly man, and she was in someone else's house. Marion went to the mirror. Her face was already beginning to show signs of beatings, and that was to her advantage. She calmed down a bit, sat back in her chair, and continued to wait for the police and ambulance. Finally, after half an hour, Marion waited for the one she had been anxiously awaiting. It was still dark outside, and the people of the neighboring houses must have been asleep, but on hearing the noise of the cars, the gawkers hurried out from behind their fences, and there were those who formed a large crowd around Michael Taylor's property. Murdered my granddad, the bastards, thieves, I suppose. He'd been giving up lately. These and many other phrases from the gawkers could be heard by ambulance and police officers. "What happened?" shouted a woman from the crowd. "We're looking into it," replied the paramedic briefly. People wanted the truth. They were eager to know it. They couldn't just leave the place and wait for the first rumors from the most clever neighbors in the area. Michael Taylor was generally well regarded by the people, though he had not lived here long. Most people thought he was a peaceful and quiet grandfather, cared for at times by his son and daughter-in-law. The police asked Marion a few questions, to which she answered as honestly as possible, believing there was nothing to hide, and concealment of the facts of what had happened, as she knew, was punishable by law. The girl was put into a police car, and as she walked along, accompanied by two men in uniform, people stared at her in silence. When she got into the car, people started whispering among themselves again. "What a nightmare. These young people have gone," shouted someone from the crowd. A little later, the doctors finished their work and carried out an elderly man on a stretcher. His face was not covered, and the villagers, seeing this, breathed a sigh of relief. The police had left, the ambulance had left, forensic experts had rushed to the scene. There was nothing to see here, as they were mostly inside the house. People went to their homes to sleep, and some people went about their daily business. The women, who were particularly impressionable, could not recover from what they had seen for a long time. They became afraid for their own lives. Nothing illegal had ever happened in this area, and no one, of course, did not expect that a murderer would come to the quiet place where mostly pensioners lived. A little later, grandparents began to go to each other and discuss what had happened. Some were even pleased that something worthwhile could finally be discussed. Barbara stopped by to see her friend Vanessa. "Vanessa, did you hear? Did you see what happened? Everyone's alive, old people are being slaughtered. Why, what was Michael's problem? Yeah, I saw and heard. I was standing there this morning. What do they say? She's a young girl. She was young, but the weird thing is, she called the police and the ambulance. Wait, what are you doing? Barbara glared at her friend. You're justifying her. She's not here. I'm just saying it's weird. They're all bastards. They don't spare us old people. She came in, she wanted money, she wanted to make a profit, and Michael turned her down. Yeah, I guess that's what happened. Prejudice was firmly planted in the woman's mind. She couldn't imagine anyone making excuses for someone who'd done grievous bodily harm to an elderly man. Not she. No one else in the area wanted to think that Michael Taylor was at fault, even though everyone knew that the girl had not run away but had stayed at his house until the police and ambulance arrived. And everyone knew about the oddities of the grandfather living at the entrance to the village. Marion was young and healthy, her victim, on the contrary, elderly and weak. And who would have thought that he wanted to rape his overnight guest, who out of desperation had risked spending the night with one of the residents of this ill-fated neighborhood? The investigation began. Michael was still in intensive care, but the doctors gave him a positive prognosis. Marion recounted all the details. She indicated the approximate time of events, talked about the nuances, answered all the questions put to her. In general, actively cooperated with the investigation, and the investigators saw that she was sincere, and her eyes were burning with the desire to get out of the detention center as soon as possible, to be acquitted. It was not only her unenviable position that marred Marion. Perhaps even more unpleasant was the fact that during her 5 days in the detention center she had never been contacted. There had been no messages or calls from either her mother or Stephen. Marion had wanted to call them both several times, but had hesitated. Something kept her from doing so. She wanted to be interested and waited for the call. So she felt that besides anxious thoughts about her future fate, she had other worries on her mind. And though they were not good either, yet in this way the girl was able to dilute her fear a little. Marion realized that she needed a good lawyer, and she still couldn't stand it. And while the investigation was dragging on and Michael had not yet come to his senses, it was worth worrying about her defense. After 5 days in the detention center, she called Stephen and told him everything. Really, why didn't you call before? He asked in confusion. I was hoping you would call. Stephen had nothing to reply to these words. He really hadn't been concerned about her all these 5 days. Marion had only called the shop manager, and Marion thought that she might have told the others about her trouble. But to her surprise, her beloved Stephen knew nothing. Do you need a lawyer? He asked Marion. Yes, I'm ashamed to ask for your help, but if you don't, no one will. Tell me, didn't you defend yourself? Yes, I told everything to the investigation. Why such questions, Stephen? Marion experienced emotional tension and was even annoyed when she heard the words of doubt from Stephen. He hurriedly reassured her. Marion, it's okay, calm down. At least come and check on me. The lawyer will be you in which detention center you are sitting. Marion told him the number of the detention center. When she hung up, she realized that he didn't even want to visit her. He was evasive. Marion never called her mother. Somehow she wasn't particularly surprised by this. Disinterest in her daughter's life was a trait that had characterized Kimberly almost all her life. She had always regarded the girl as an obligation. And now, after a week without hearing from her, she concluded that she would come forward sooner or later. But if she is in distress, this important question was absent from the mother's mind in grief. Morris, you have a visitor. Marion heard from the guard. A lawyer had come to see her, and her first question to him was, "Who are you from?" Stephen had not lied. He had sent his man to her, and he was ready to take up her case seriously and intimately. Mr. Christopher immediately reassured the defendant. It's not a difficult case, just tell it like it is. Marion sighed, having to recall again the terrible story of the lustful owner of the house on the edge of the city. After about 20 minutes of careful listening, Mr. Christopher, a thin man, brunette, glasses, with a concentrated face, crossed his palms and moved a little closer to the accused. You've done well. This is all very important. I think we're going to win this case. I'd like to believe that. Shaking her head slightly, sadly, looking somewhere away, Marion said, You know, by the way, that our Michael Taylor is already in the ward. Awake, will soon testify. A strong color stuck to Marion's face. She was frightened. This must be bad. Believe me, I have a lot of experience in these cases. He won't make it. Of course he'll tell his stories. It's a very good thing you're left with a clear beating. You have no motive. You stayed at the scene of the crime. Nothing was stolen. You can just calm down and wait for the exit. Mr. Christopher collected his papers in his briefcase, and after saying goodbye and wishing Marian patience, he left. Dad, what's wrong? Well, you tell me, come on. A large, tall man in shirt and trousers almost ran into the room. He looked about 40 years old and was in an agitated state. How did they let you in, quarantine? The grandfather looked at his son in surprise. Dad, they let me in. And let me in. The man sat down on a chair near his father's bed. He looked at him patiently, waiting for some explanation of what had happened. Why, you don't know anything yourself, lawyer. Dad, I know everything. I want to hear you. Is she some kind of psychopath? She didn't even take anything. She wanted to kill me. Michael got up from the bed in a state of near rage. Well, calm down, Dad, calmed his son, gently put his hands on his shoulders. Lie down, rest if you want. Let's not talk about it now. No, you started it. I'll continue. Sadist, she wanted to kill me. How do I know why? Michael Taylor was clearly in a bad mood. His son Edward was determined to derail the conversation. In between asking him questions about his health, about the hospital kitchen and the doctors, he decided that he would have to come again when his father had calmed down and was ready to talk about what had happened in his home without emotion. For Marian, the time spent in the isolation ward dragged on at a terribly slow pace. Mr. Christopher had failed to fully convince her that her actions would qualify as self-defense. Some uncomfortable feeling could not leave her, as if everything was not so simple in this case. On the eve of the hearing, Mr. Christopher once again went to see his client. He was in high spirits and simply confident of victory. Marian, don't worry, everything will be fine. Tomorrow be sure and say everything as you told me. You were in agitation, plus self-defense, attempted rape. That'll put our Michael Taylor in jail, Marian's lawyer said with a smile on his face. The convict was silent for most of this conversation, just nodding and occasionally speaking. I see. The closer the trial got, the more anxious she felt. The night before the trial, Marian remembered her mother, brother, and sister. She had a strange feeling that the family had a life of its own, and that they were not her own people. Little by little, she began to involuntarily forget their images and memories associated with the house. The trial began in the morning. Marian prepared herself for the trial. She had her hair combed and even put on a little makeup and wore a clean change of clothes that she had taken with her to the detention center. She looked like a normal, decent, and civilized girl. The image at the trial had to play a positive role. In her case, it was important. Many had already labeled Marian a dangerous criminal, a marginal, and a thief. There were rumors that Michael was not the first victim of the killer, and that she dealt exclusively with lonely pensioners. But this time she had a serious client. Everyone in the area knew of Marian's blunder. Marian sat behind the bar and watched the people entering the hall. She said hello to Mr. Christopher, and he once again cheered her up by saying, "It's going to be fine." Marian Morris. Some of Michael's neighbors came in. Marian hadn't seen them, of course, and wouldn't remember them, but they were elderly people, outwardly different from the city folk, and she concluded that it was Michael's support group that had come. She saw him too, but immediately looked away. He still disgusted her. Sitting next to him was apparently his lawyer, a tall, statuesque man in his mid-40s. The most unexpected thing for the defendant happened when a woman and her teenage son, who were very familiar to her, entered the courtroom. It was Kimberly and Jack, Marian's mother and brother. She stared at them for a long moment, wonderingly trying to meet her mother's gaze. Jack waved his hand to his sister, but her mother immediately cut him off. She did not look at her daughter, feeling that she was looking at her. Why did she come here? And with Jack thought Marian. The hearing of the case began. When Michael's lawyer introduced himself to Marian, she turned pale. His last name was Taylor, the same as her abuser's. She stared at his face, then shifted her gaze to the victim. Yes, they did look alike. Was it really his relative? His son Marian no longer expected anything good from this trial. Though her defender, Mr. Christopher, looked quite confident in his statement, but when his opponent began his speech, he began to listen carefully to his words. The speech was filled with complex language, and everyone with a little knowledge of the law realized that this man was serious and knew his case well. Many were also struck by the emotionality with which he spoke about the case. Especially attentive guessed what was the reason for such an ardent concern of the lawyer to the old victim, who risked to become the accused that day. Alas, it did not happen. Against all sound logic, against Mr. Christopher's efforts, and against all the facts that had been presented to the court, Marion was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for robbery. Hearing the judge's words, Mr. Christopher's face changed. What assault? He addressed the judge so that no one could hear him. What's the matter with you? Mr. Christopher, sit down and calm down. You'll appeal if you have to. The judge answered him calmly. The man looked shattered. He had lost a rare event in his 20 years of practice. Marion saw the bailiffs as they approached. She watched Mr. Christopher's face, hoping he would look at her, though she didn't know why she wanted to make contact with him. He stood gloomily for a moment in one place, and pretending to be so puzzled that he had forgotten Marion, walked slowly towards the exit. "Mr. Christopher, what now?" Marion shouted. The bailiffs had already entered the defendant's cell, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Christopher disappeared into the crowd of spectators leaving the hall. Marion was still in the detention center for some time. She kept waiting for Stephen's call, still unwilling to accept the fact that she would soon be a prisoner. Maybe they'll reconsider, appeal, she thought, sitting within the 4 walls of this horrible room she was never supposed to enter. Finally, Marion got a phone call. It was her young man, though she wasn't sure anymore. His voice was initially depressed, and that didn't bode well for Marion. "Well, what is it?" In a pleading voice she asked. "Yes, Marion, you see, Mr. Christopher is a very good lawyer. I paid him a lot. He didn't expect this, you know. The thing is, this Edward, he's the freak's son. But not only that. What else? He's a powerful lawyer. I heard that Michael, this weirdo in there with them, did not want to live with them in the city. Wanted to his native village, where he grew up. All these long summarizations were not only unnecessary for Marion, but also irritating. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked Stephen. "Why are you telling me all this? Is it bad or not?" "Marion, I don't have that much money. Mr. Christopher told me the amount, but it's a lot too. Others will take even more. And this one is an acquaintance." "How much, Stephen?" Marion asked, almost crying. "Well, 1 million. We, of course, on friendly terms, agreed that half of the amount in case of loss he will return. But you know, 100,000,000 I cannot get nowhere. But it's just 1 million. Stephen, I'm going down, you know." There was an uncomfortable silence at both ends of the wire. Stephen kept silent because he didn't want to offend or upset the girl. Marion said nothing. She waited for his final answer. "Marion," finally softly spoke Stephen. "Well, first of all, it is a colony of settlement. It is not strict regime. And secondly, well, 5 years and parole. I'm sure you will go out on parole." These words were too horrible for Marion. She hung up the phone. Marion, hello?" On this day, Territorial Superintendent Stephen Howard decided to take no further interest in this girl's life. When she tried to call him for help and made her most fatal and possibly stupid decision of her life to go to a sleepover with a stranger, he was having a great time with a nice lady who had been waiting for reciprocation from him for a long time. Lately, Stephen had been unsure of his feelings for the young and simple girl Marion, because one way or another he was influenced by the opinion of those around him. He was independent and had no authority. But one day he himself thought that he felt uncomfortable in the company of a shop girl, or maybe he just took and changed because people change. Marion Morris, a 24-year-old shop assistant at a grocery shop chain. The girl, circumstances that one day did not work out in her favor, went to the colony. At first she was scared, but fortunately in the colony of settlement lived, and quite decent, not broken by prison women. It was to such women that the newcomer tried to get closer. Still, sometimes she had to show her teeth here. Like in the men's prison, this colony had its own chief or pahanka. Her name was Jennifer, and this was the 4th time she had been here. One had to respect this imposing woman with a not very feminine tattoo on her arm. There were always a few female settlers walking beside her like jackals. All of these women were unpleasant in appearance. From their appearance you could roughly determine their articles. One was a thief with experience. Another killed her husband in another drunkenness. But Jennifer herself, already in the 4th time, caught in a major fraud. She began her dirty career with an assistant to a serious businessman and part-time criminal mastermind of the city, and it was back in the 90s. Young Jennifer liked to live life to the fullest, and even after the first walk, she decided not to stop there and become even more successful. Except that the woman never wanted to earn according to conscience. She had no children, no husbands, and somewhere in her hometown remained an unhappy mother. Not long ago, who learned from neighbors about the criminal biography of her daughter, Jennifer all told her that she went abroad for a long time, and she piously believed her and even rejoiced for her in anticipation of seeing her only beloved daughter again. But through one of her neighbors, the truth was accidentally revealed. It was before Jennifer's last conviction. She and her mother had had a terrible fight, and in her heart, her daughter called her some very nasty words and left. A few weeks later, she had another case she wanted to drop because it was quite a risky move, but remembering the difficult conversation with her mother, she decided, okay, nobody needs me here anyway. And again, Jennifer and several of her partners had to go to jail for fraud. Marion was settling in. It wasn't so bad. She found something new to do here. She started sewing often, even when her working hours were over. She was also fond of beading, and this activity calmed her and temporarily removed all bad thoughts from her head. Somewhere in the sewing room on a shelf there was a magazine with weaving schemes. That afternoon Marion studied it and asked one of the inmates, the shop manager, to get some beads so that she could make crafts from the magazine. Margaret, the supervisor's name, was a kind and understanding person, and to Marion's delight, in a couple of days she brought her a large amount of material for her new creation. Her meditations, sitting on her bunk and threading the little balls on the thread one by one, Marion began to forget all her troubles, enjoying her work, which almost from the beginning she had been doing well. Interrupting her positive thoughts, 4 women entered the cell. Jennifer was among them. Marion was afraid of this bulky woman, partly because she almost never walked alone, and many colonists had told of her cruelty. Jennifer looked at Marion with a contemptuous smile, who pretended not to notice the women who had entered the room. But how could she not notice them? "What are you doing in business, new girl?" Marion's plowwoman asked impudently. Realizing from Jennifer's tone that she did not come in peace, Marion decided not to answer anything. "I made up a nickname for her, Beads," shouted one of Jennifer's 6. All but the main one appreciated her friend's joke and laughed too. It was an unpleasant sight. These ladies were clearly out of the local color of the colony, which in general was not so bad. "All right, I'm not supposed to be quiet around here. Last name, first name." Jennifer spoke. "Marion Morris." Marion put her work aside and looked at the woman. The newcomer's eyes were full of a confidence uncommon to newcomers, and a kind of desperate insolence, which was of course bad form for someone like her. "Are you so bold?" Jennifer asked in surprise. Marion again made no reply, thinking the colonist's behavior a provocation. Her behavior offended the unspoken leader of the colony. "Well, I hear you've been weaving your stuff around here, that you've started selling it, but that's not the way it works. So 80% of your shit is coming to me. Look, it'll be under control." Marion remained stubbornly silent. She picked up her weave and continued working as if they had all left the cell. "Have you learnt everything?" No, Marion answered. "But then, now the girls will crush you a little." And for a few moments Jennifer waited. She hoped that Marion, under the pressure of the threat, would agree to her unprofitable business plan. But alas, she gave her friends a gesture, and they began to approach Marion. A fight broke out. Jennifer, as former prisoners, calculated everything. Almost no one was in the building of the colony. All went to community service. The administration was usually eating lunch at this time, and there were no guards here to monitor the prisoners. Marion didn't scream for help. She wasn't the tiniest girl, but she had never been in a fight before. She reckoned that this was her first time as well, for against Michael she was rather just defending herself. Of course she couldn't do it against 3 men, but she remembered the feeling of overwhelming rage she had felt when the man responsible for her mangled fate had touched her underwear. Jennifer's girls had had it. For one ended with a broken nose, for another with a black eye and a nail-scarred cheek. Still, Marion was beaten. She lay on the floor, holding her stomach. It only hurt, but surprisingly she did not feel fear, resentment, or despair that day or later. Marion lay on the floor for some time, beaten by the felons, though she was able to get up. Then she crawled quietly from the floor to her bunk and put her hands on her head, She thought about her future fate in this place. Jennifer, strangely enough, had stopped pestering the needlewoman who had appeared in the colony and had told her own not to hurt her either. Morris, don't touch her. She's a hard woman of ours. I heard that she wanted to kill the old man who was bothering her, she told the girls. The colony's chief gangster even developed a certain sympathy for this young prisoner with a beautiful and rare name. Marion worked exclusively for herself, giving her trinkets to the girls and women with whom she most often socialized, or even selling them. One day, one of the prison authorities took an interest in her work, and that's how Marion got her first big money in prison. The work was painstaking, but the necklace of pink flowers came out simply amazing, and all in joy the customer paid her $2,000 for her hard work. Soon Marion decided to follow the example of some other women from the colony who had been in captivity for a long time and were beginning to go mad from the monotony of their lives. Some of them also began to weave beads, and some of them sewed clothes from patterns, and there were also those who simply embroidered cross-stitch, so to speak, for the soul. And you have brought creativity into our society. Look, everyone is doing something. Lillian sits all day long and embroiders her flowers. Yes, I can see it's fun, Marion smiled. Linda was the nicest person she had ever met. She was not only interesting to talk to, but also to share her feelings. This prisoner had a feeling of caring for Marion and her fate. She was the first to hear the story of the lustful old man from whom she had to defend herself. At first, Marion's story shocked her, and she could not calm down for a long time, asking her friend about the case, whether it was possible to appeal against the court decision, and whether there were people ready to fight for her. Then, having learnt that the girl had a bigger problem in her free life than her criminal record, namely the complete indifference of all her relatives and acquaintances, including her mother, Linda calmed down and stopped asking her uncomfortable questions and just sympathized with her. A year passed. No one had visited Marion once during that time. At first, listening to stories of women about how their visits with their mother, with their son, with their husband had gone, she became sad and even at times wanted to cry. Then she got used to this pain and dissolved in her daily activities. So in beading, community service, socializing with good girls from the colony, and thinking about life after prison, 2 more years passed unnoticed. Marion turned 27 years old. She was young, beautiful, and forced to sit in jail only because she had prevented a lusty old man from being abused. A few days after her birthday, which she celebrated in a tight circle of good friends, Linda among them, she was summoned to the office of the colony director. Marion was terrified and told Linda about the event. "Yes, wait. Why are you nervous?" Linda hurried to calm her friend. "I don't know. What if I did something wrong? Maybe it's because of the sale of their products." "Well, you told me that Cheryl Jones ordered something from you." "Yeah, that's why it's weird. I've been trying to remember for 3 years, and I can't figure out where I went wrong." "Look, what makes you think it's something bad? What's good?" Marion grinned nervously. The girl, even though she liked the life in captivity lately, she was counting the days until she left the colony. She had only 2 years left, and again she could live as a human being in freedom. However, thinking about it a little deeper, she began to get a little upset. "I'll get out, but what then? Where to go? I won't go to my mom. I won't go to Stephen, but he won't expect me." Marion knew that she would have to look for a job and a place to live. And these thoughts burdened her, and yet Marion looked forward to freedom. Like most of the women in the colony who'd come here, some for robbery, some for theft, and some like her by coincidence by life's injustices. She walked slowly to her boss's office, fearing not only bad news from him, but illegal actions. Now, after the incident with Michael, she was afraid of strange men, and willy-nilly in ambiguous situations the girl was frightened. She became uncomfortable and frightened. "Marion Morris, why are you standing there?" "I'm waiting for you." The headmaster, a man in his 50s with a full head of gray, looked out of the office. "Hello," Marion replied briefly. William Butler, that was the name of the director of the colony, politely asked the prisoner to sit down. As she entered the office, she immediately noticed the woman sitting at the large desk to the left of the director's desk. Now she was no longer so afraid of William Butler. The woman was Amanda Hill, a social worker who had worked with the female prisoners here for a long time, and she had a kind face. The colonists loved Amanda. Yes, she could not solve all the burning questions of her wards, but she always sincerely tried to help people in their trouble. and just a personal conversation with her was sometimes a balm to the soul of these women. Amanda had no children, and she seemed to give all her motherly love to them. "Marian Morris, how are you enjoying your stay in our institution, so to speak?" William Butler chuckled slightly at his own words, shifting his gaze from Marian to the teacher. "It's fine, I like it." Marian was startled, and it was noticeable. "Marian Morris, can I ask why you're so tense right now?" Amanda addressed the prisoner. "I'm worried," Marian replied. "Why should you be worried?" Smiled William Butler, who, according to Marian's findings, had been a lively and cheerful man that day. There was silence. William Butler was staring at some papers. Perhaps it was a file on the prisoner Morris. Amanda Hill was careful not to let Marian notice her gaze. "All right, ladies, well, Marian Morris, your lawyer, Mr. Christopher, has filed a motion with the court for your parole." "How?" Marian was surprised. "Didn't you know anything?" "No." Marian was confused. Stephen hadn't reported in for 3 years. Was it Mr. Christopher's own initiative? She could not believe that she might be able to get out of the colony early. The prisoner's face changed visibly. She was radiant with joy. But she tried not to show it and listened attentively to William Butler. "So you talked to Amanda and she'll tell you everything. There'll be a medical examination soon, mind you, and then the trial. In general, I've written you the most positive characteristic, because we here with comrades know about your hobbies, that you sew there, or beadwork, you're about to do it, and that you have a positive influence on the inmates of the colony. In general, the main thing is not to worry and believe in the best. So the court will decide." Marian asked anxiously. "Yes, the court will decide everything, but we are for you." Marian thanked William Butler for the good news, and together with Amanda they went out to talk. As they wandered around the large colony grounds, they chatted about the parole process. Marian asked the educator with great interest about how it would go and what she herself had to do to be granted parole. At night before she went to bed, she was full of bright new impressions and thought of Mr. Christopher. Why did he help her? Marian was quite sure that the man had already forgotten her in that unpleasant case. It had been a long time since she had thought of him, but as it turned out, he not only remembered, but was willing to help her. The medical board found no reason to deny Morris parole. A little later, a hearing was held in the local court, where the only familiar face in the room this time was Mr. Christopher. The hearing was quick and successful. The result was the granting of the application for conditional early release of the convict under the article robbery, which meant that in 10 days, young, beautiful, and still not broken, believing in the best, Marian Morris was waiting for her long-awaited freedom. She already knew about it from the words of ex-criminals who had once been released on parole. It was the beginning of March. Although the whole earth was still covered with snow, and in general in nature there were almost no signs of spring, Marian felt it with all her body and with all her soul. She wanted to shout, "Freedom!" But the girl's quiet disposition prevented her from doing so. She stood for some time near the high fence with barbed wire, smoking and greedily gulping the air, which this day seemed much sweeter than before. Well, Marian went to her hometown, and this time she had money with her, and there she rented a place to live. In this she was helped by one of her acquaintances, with whom they had established good contacts while Marian was still in the colony. They began to communicate even more often than before. No one helped Marian with work. She soon found a job as a saleswoman at a cash register. The problems of the former prisoner began almost immediately after the beginning of life on the outside. It was not bad, and Marian liked it very much. A fresh start, perhaps, so she imagined her future fate when she was behind bars. But a couple of weeks later, a manager approached her at work when she was putting the goods on the shelves. "Marian, can I have a word with you?" "Yes, say it right here." "What are you talking about?" Marian asked, engrossed in her work. "Marian, it won't work here. It's important." They both went outside. The weather was fine, it was April, and it was even hot at times. "Marian, you see, today I was told from above. They say that you do not meet the qualification requirements here." The manager was very embarrassed. It was hard for her to inform this hard-working girl, who from the very first days of her work in this small grocery shop began to show enthusiasm and professionalism, that she was fired. "I see I don't fit in." Marian grinned. "Marian, what can I do?" "I was told to tell you." "Yeah, it's all about the criminal record. I know it's not your fault." Even though Marian was depressed that day, she knew there was no point in trying so hard to please the manager. She finished the day perfectly, without any complaints. "I'm sorry to see you go," her boss told her as she walked her out the next day. Marian just smiled sadly and walked to the bus stop with a cigarette. She smoked more and more often and worried about her future fate. It was an unpleasant day for Marian. She realized that she had no money to pay her rent and no success in finding a new job. She didn't want to be a beggar to her mother, but she decided to visit her family, at least to see her brother Jack and sister Cassandra. She stood for a long time in front of the windows of her home, hesitating to enter. It was her pride. In 3 years, her mother had never once bothered to find out about her. How could it be? Suddenly, her mind was full of different thoughts. What if something had happened to her? What if Marian, horrified at her own reasoning, went with a quick step into the flat? It was late in the evening. Everyone must be at home, and she rang the doorbell. It was Marian. She answered briefly to the sound of the inner door opening. A male, unfamiliar voice was heard in the distance. Another minute of fussing outside the door, and she was opened. "Marian, what are you doing here so early?" It was not a joke. It was a real misunderstanding on her mother's part, and Marian did not know whether to laugh or cry. In simple words, she was not welcome here. She walked to the living room. Her sister Cassandra was sitting there watching cartoons. Is it really her, Marian thought. The girl was all grown up, had grown-up features. Marian. Cassandra broke away from the TV series and ran up to her older sister. Marian couldn't contain her emotions. She took the girl in her arms, even though she was already overweight, and spun her around a little in front of her. "Cassandra, have you grown so big? You're 13, aren't you?" "Wow. I'm 13. And you're 20? Marian stared at her sister. Then her face turned from surprise to full of joyful emotion, and she laughed. "Cassandra, are you doing well in maths?" "How much?" Marian wondered. "I won't tell you." An unfamiliar man entered the room. He reluctantly said hello to his guest. Matthew. Matthew was tall and broad-shouldered and looked to be about 50 years old. Marian. "Nice to meet you. I'm your mother's husband." "I see," Marian replied quietly. Also, a lot had changed here, but not her mother's attitude towards her. "Mum, where's Jack?" Marian asked her mother at the table. They had all sat down to supper. "Jack lives alone now, not far from here. Would you like the address?" "Yes, of course." "Are you going to sleep over?" "No," said Marian modestly. "Come on. Where would you go at night? Do you have a place to stay or not?" Kimberly tried to be a bit of a caring mother, but she was not very good at it, and it didn't last long. The housemates persuaded Marian to stay the night and prepared a cot with clean linen. Before going to bed, Kimberly visited her daughter and they chatted about the detention. Marian talked about the future and the good lawyer, Mr. Christopher. And then her mother, for the umpteenth time in this life, upset her. "Marian," said gently and quietly to Kimberly, "I beg you very much, don't pretend to live here. Matthew and I are living so well. Jack has moved out. I'm finally happy. You understand me as a woman." "Mum," said Marian, "I'm not claiming anything." And that was the end of the conversation. They said goodnight to each other, and then Marian packed her things and left. Before leaving, her mother wanted to slip some note into her pocket. It was only 500, but Marian grinned sweetly, handed the money back and said, "Leave it. It's more important to you." She looked at Cassandra, who was as always staring at the television, even though the day was just beginning and she didn't even notice that Marian was leaving. The touching feeling she had for her was still there. She was a little sister, but Marian realized that everyone here would always be a stranger to her, and 13-year-old Cassandra was becoming more and more like her mother, losing her naive and childlike image. "Cassandra, at least go say goodbye to Marian." The girl reluctantly started and walked towards the corridor, all looking back at the TV screen. "Well, Cassandra, goodbye." Marian walked wherever she was going. She was only paying a month in advance, which meant that in a week or so she would have to move out due to not being able to pay for the room. She just wanted to wander around her hometown. Tears came to her at one point as she thought of her mother's words to her the night before. Marian hadn't been lying when she said she didn't need a place to live. She herself did not want to live in a flat with a strange man, and a man who would never be her family, who was only nominally so. Mother, who is this? Is it only worth giving birth to be called by that great sacred word? The last bright idea of family was disappearing in the girl's soul. She was at liberty, but she had neither work nor lodging, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. Stephen, the last time they had seen each other was a long time ago. It was early February, a whole 3 years ago. Back then, their relationship had come to a head and ended without announcement because Marion had gone to juvie. He was relatively young, good-looking, and successful. I don't stand a chance, thought Marion as she sat in her room, listening to the occasional scandalous yelling coming from the next room. It was late in the evening. Without deciding anything, she went to bed. In the morning, having filtered all her thoughts and considerations overnight, Marion decided to go to Stephen's. She wasn't counting on anything, just financial help. He had helped her with her lawyer after all, and you could say, albeit indirectly, he had been involved in her parole. Perhaps he would give her some money for the first time, and that was fine with the ex-convict, who was practically at the bottom of her life. She wrote him a short message. It's Varia. I'm free. You don't be afraid of me. I'm still the same. Tomorrow I'll be outside the shop at the Forest Cafe at 8. Marion was waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee. He was on time. He didn't have to wait a minute. From even farther away he smiled and pronounced, "Well, here we meet at last." Marion didn't hear anything, but smiled too and waved at him. "Yes, I see you, hello." The man hugged his acquaintance warmly and sat down opposite. "How are you?" asked Marion. "Yes, better than anyone else. I went even higher." "Wow, and what are you now?" "Yeah, I'm a regional manager. We don't just have New York locations anymore. We have Chicago, Florida, and Washington, D.C. now. So they're all over the place. Luckily, I was here yesterday and I'm here today. I'll be somewhere else tomorrow." "Wow." Marion was surprised. "You're doing great." "Just a little." Stephen smiled satisfactorily, full of pride. "I congratulate you on this event." "Thanks, but what about you?" "Got a place to live? Got a job?" "Well, it's hard right now. I couldn't even get a job at a grocery store." "I don't know, I'll keep looking." "And housing?" "I've been living in a flat for the last week." She sighed heavily and sadly. "What's wrong, Marion?" Stephen asked gently. "I don't want to be a beggar, but I'm in a bad situation." "Come on, Marion, we always help our own. I'll put 1,100 on your card for the first time. If you have any problems, just ask." Marion was glad that at least someone on this earth was not indifferent to her difficult situation. She had become accustomed to hardship, not wanting to live at the expense of others, and the money Stephen had given her she saw simply as salvation. No longer did she want to use it. Sitting in a cafe, she saw the ring on his finger and realized he was married. Stephen probably had children by now as well. He was a little different from his old self. He didn't have that lightness, and he spoke to her in a polite, decent way, leaving no hint at the end of the evening of any further development of the relationship. He was also a stranger to her, and yet she was grateful to him for another rescue. Standing on the balcony of her new accommodation, which she had paid for 2 months in advance, now feeling relatively stable, Marion smoked and enjoyed the cool late April day. She was determined. "I'll look for a job and I'll find one, but people. Who do I need? Self has me." She raised her head high, closed her eyes, and through the small slit of her thin lips, slowly the thick cigarette smoke seeped out. The summer came. Marion found a job. She was hired at a beauty parlor, cleaning the premises. She didn't just scrub the floors. The girl watched the work of masters who painted the visitors' nails, cut hair, corrected eyebrows, and applied eyelashes. In the future, Marion wanted to learn one of these professions, but to do this, it was necessary to earn money for the courses. When she had the first money, she immediately went to a needlework shop and bought a lot of beads. In the evenings, tired from scrubbing the parlor floors, Marion strung the little balls on thread, remembering her days in the colony. Strange thoughts crossed her mind. She missed those days, for in that life there were people like herself with whom she could have a heart-to-heart talk, and they wouldn't look at you as an outsider, no matter what you told them about your plight. One fine day, and it was fine, because it was a Saturday, Marion received a call from a stranger. Here we go, another divorce. Who else could it be, she thought sadly. Still, Marion answered the call. Hello, I'm listening. There was silence. Marion was about to press the red button, but then she heard a man's voice. Is this Marion? Yes, Marion, who is this? Marion, don't hang up right away. It's the man on the other end of the line was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking. Tell me, who are you? Marion asked in bewilderment. I'm your dad. I have a lot to say, but don't hang up. I'm not hanging up. Calm down. Which dad is it, Marcus? No, this is your real daddy. My name is Sebastian. I was in contact with your mom, Kimberly, about 30 years ago. I'm asking you not to reject me right away. You're not living well. You need alimony. You'd better be honest with me, Marion replied resentfully, thinking that this man wanted only profit from her. We are like that, replied the man cheerfully. Well, I'm for honesty. No one needs me in this life, Papa, and I have no money, and I have no home. I have nothing and nobody. Yes, I know, but I have everything, but I have no one to share it with. You're the only one I've got. Well, will you come visit me in Florida? Where? Marion asked me. I live in Florida, I have my own business here. I know your mom a little bit. So I told her, like you, that I have nothing. I'm starving. I need help. She told me about you too. She said let her provide for you, but I knew you were my daughter. Anyway, it's not a phone conversation. I'll send you my address. Come and talk to me. Marion hung up the phone. She realized that everything in her life very soon and very abruptly changed. Not resenting fate, not expecting anything good from it, and yet not being angry at the world. Through suffering, pain, betrayals, and hardships, she finally waited for her bright streak. How could you think of an old woman having a baby? Ashley, a blonde girl of 13, stood on the porch of the school and watched as her friend Emily, who was in the same class as her, talked to her older brother. Ashley dreamed now of being in her classmate's shoes and having a conversation with the guy. The girl had fallen in love with her friend's brother Jason last year, and she didn't even realize how it happened. Ashley just woke up one day with thoughts of this teenager, and after that she thought about the guy all the time. As soon as the girl realized that she had fallen in love, she started giving signs of attention to the high schooler. She planted unsigned love notes, but soon she, as a secret admirer, was exposed, and ridicule from Jason's buddy followed. Ashley felt strongly about it at the time. However, her mother Mary, who knew about her daughter's crush, told her to keep her mind off the guy. You're still young, and it's far away. You're not in love, just a crush. As time passes, you'll laugh at your own crush. But a year had passed and Ashley was still in love with Jason. And now she was standing there watching Emily's friend talking to her brother. Ashley, watching the conversation between the two, dreamed about how her lover would come to her and confess his feelings to her. The girl noticed her friend and her brother heading towards her. Ashley felt a slight shiver go down her spine. She tried to pull herself together. In the meantime, the pair approached her, and Jason said with a good-natured smile, "Hey you need to grow up a little." And then, looking back at the older kids, maybe you're expecting those words from me. But my sister has already told me that you are withering from unrequited love. Ashley, hearing those words, shuddered involuntarily, as if from a blow. The girl looked at her friend reproachfully, and then she turned and ran away. At the moment, she didn't care that she was acting like a cranky little girl. Ashley was annoyed by her lover's words. She was also hurt that her friend was secretly talking to her brother about her. Ashley ran and heard Emily asking her to stop and talk. However, the girl was not responding to her mate's cries. Ashley wanted to run home now, lock herself in her room, and let the tears flow, which soon happened. When the girl calmed down, she made a vow to herself that she would not talk to her friend again, and she also promised herself that she would tear her love for Jason out of her heart and would not look in his direction again. And when Mary's mother came home from work, Ashley pronounced to her, "I don't hang out with Emily anymore. So if she comes over, just tell her I'm not here." "What'd you get? It's no big deal. You'll make up in a couple days. By the way, what was the fight about? What was it about?" "It's a long conversation. Emily's a traitor. That's a pretty big thing to say. You can't make such serious accusations against a man, especially since Emily is your friend. Why don't you tell me what happened? Mary said affectionately and sat down next to her daughter. Ashley looked at her mother carefully, then excitedly told her what had happened. The woman listened to her daughter, and then she patted her head and said softly, "Your friend cares about you. She wanted to do you a good favor. Emily thought that talking to her brother about you might help draw the boy's attention to you. But what her friend didn't realize was that you can't command the heart. If Jason doesn't care about you, there's nothing you can do about it." Mary paused for a moment. Then, with a sad sigh, she said, "You surprised me, daughter. I thought you weren't thinking about Jason anymore. You're getting a little secretive. Or is it my own fault that I don't notice anything but work?" "Mom, don't say that," Ashley said. "I'm not hiding anything from you, I just don't want to worry you. You really work so hard that I don't want you to worry about me. Taking care of you is the best part for me. You're the only one I've got. And you have to work hard for one simple reason: you need money. Your grandparents on my side of the family are long gone. Your father divorced me 2 years ago and forgot about the obligation to pay child support. And your grandparents on your daddy's side don't need you. Why not? You see, daughter, in some families it happens that parents have 2 children and one child becomes the favorite. That's what happened in your daddy's family. He didn't become a favorite from mom and dad, and as a result they don't need you as a granddaughter. If before the divorce with your father they still congratulated you on your birthday, now it does not happen. And you know it yourself. Mom, you always told me that you and Dad got divorced because that's how life works. How does it happen?" her daughter asked her mother in a low voice. Ashley had longed to know the answer, but there had never been the right occasion for such a conversation. Mary sighed softly, put her arm around her and said, "You're getting older and older every day, and I don't even notice it. Well, I'll answer your question. Your father fell in love with another woman who gave him a child, the son he dreamed of. So he made a choice, but not in our direction. Just don't blame him or judge him. Life is complicated. You'll realize that later." After talking to her mom, Ashley felt a lot better. She even took her mind off the fact that she was upset with her friend. The girl kept thinking about the relationship between her parents, and also pondered how she would act in her mother's situation. And in the evening, when Emily called to apologize, Ashley interrupted her and said that she was no longer offended. But she added, "Now it's nothing personal. I won't trust you, or you'll tell the whole world." Time moved on, and now Ashley was 16. The New Year's Eve ball was coming up. The girl carefully thought over her closet for these holidays. She hoped that her friend's brother would come to the ball. Ashley told Emily that she had invited Jason to the event, and Ashley, against all odds, secretly continued to love Jason all this time. And now the girl is already in the auditorium where the New Year's Eve ball has begun. She looks around, hoping to see her lover. Ashley nervously corrects the gatherings on her cornflower-colored dress. The girl had seen this outfit in the store a long time ago, and her mother went to meet her needs and bought it without paying for utilities. Ashley knew about all this, and when the purchase was made, she was nervous because she knew how sensitive they were to late payments. But she wasn't thinking about that now. She wanted to see Jason and to win him over with her appearance. For some reason, she was sure that would happen. Ashley was not fooled in her expectations. Slow music started playing and the DJ announced a white dance. A classmate approached the girl to ask her to dance. Ashley smilingly wanted to point out that the ladies were now choosing the suitors while agreeing, as she suddenly noticed Jason, who had just walked into the auditorium with a buddy. Ashley smiled at her classmate and bluntly refused the offer to dance. The girl fixed her blonde curls, headed toward Jason, walked up to the young man, smiled radiantly, and spoke amiably. "Perhaps tonight your highness will indulge us in a dance at the New Year's Eve ball." Jason looked at the girl, although he saw her at school every day, but on weekdays she seemed to him to be an ordinary schoolgirl who was not different from her peers. Basically, the guy just didn't pay attention to Ashley. But at that moment, she stood in front of him, as if she were a chic woman who had stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. Jason looked at Ashley and couldn't understand how in one day she could transform herself so much. He couldn't help but voice his thoughts aloud. You're like a fairy tale, from an ugly duckling to a beautiful swan. I can't believe I'm standing in front of Ashley, the same Ashley who's been bugging me for years with her crushes. Are you going to grumble or dance with me when the music stops? He said with a smile. Ashley didn't say anything else, but simply stepped toward Jason. Soon the couple was dancing. Ashley couldn't believe that she was being embraced by the man she'd dreamed of for so many years, that he would notice her in some way. And Jason continued to marvel at how much his sister's friend had changed. The dance ended. Ashley hurried over to Emily. Jason tried to hold her back, but she just smiled back and headed toward her friend. Emily winked at her friend, but she waved back and sat down on a bench. The music in the room was energetic. Ashley watched the dancers and occasionally glanced at Jason, who was also watching her. At one point she looked at the guy again, but he was gone. She looked around confused as she suddenly heard the DJ's announcement. This beautiful tune one man dedicates to a beautiful girl named Ashley and asks her to dance. Before Ashley realized what was being said, Jason appeared in front of her and held out his hand. Jason offered to dance again, and soon the couple was dancing to a beautiful melody. They danced together more than once that night, and when the New Year's Eve ball was over, Jason volunteered to walk them home. The couple walked down the snowy road, holding hands. At first they were silent, unable to find the right words. But when they reached the girl's house, Jason suddenly turned Ashley toward him and said quietly, "Will you be my girlfriend?" Ashley laughed, then showed her boyfriend her tongue and hurried toward the house. Jason frowned. "I don't see what's so funny. I'm serious." After he said that, the girl stopped and then walked leisurely back toward Jason. Once next to him, she looked into his eyes and whispered, "Do you know how much I want to tell you right now? How long have I waited for you to notice me? I've endured your friends' taunts, your condescending attitude toward me, as if I were a juvenile who couldn't be taken seriously. And now you're just offering to be your girlfriend. How do I know tomorrow it won't be another joke to amuse my friends?" "Ashley, what are you talking about?" "Yeah, there was a time when I made fun of you, but this is serious. I really want you to be my girlfriend, and I promise that no one will hurt you now." Ashley smiled, waved, and headed home. Jason didn't stop her. Once inside, the girl was greeted by Mary's mother, who saw who was seeing her daughter off. Mary asked how the ball had gone, but all she heard in response was, "Fine." The woman came over and hugged her daughter gently, but Ashley suddenly snuggled into her shoulder and cried. Mary held her tighter against her, and when she calmed down a little, she said softly, "Jason's been paying attention to you. And you don't believe him? Or is there another reason you're crying?" For you, Jason was like conquering a summit. Ashley was going for it. And this is the finale. What's he got going for him? Mammoth, what are you saying? I really love Jason. What finale? Ashley shouted indignantly and broke free from her mother's embrace. It was at that moment that the mother realized that her daughter had actually fallen in love with the guy. The woman only softly mouthed in response, "That's how you know what the feeling is. Look, just don't lose your head." The next day, Jason met Ashley after school and then walked her home. And from that day on, the two began to see each other differently. They tried to meet at every spare moment to be together. A month later, Jason confessed his love for the girl. Time passed, and Jason graduated from high school, after which he was soon drafted into the army. Ashley knew perfectly well that the lover initially wants to serve, wait until he turns 18, and after that to sign. The girl was not against the decision of the chosen one. Especially the decision of the guy pleased Jason's parents and Ashley's mother, who wanted the young people not to hurry with a trip to the registry office. Jason served and returned home. He enrolled in college and Ashley was in the 11th grade. Young people continued to meet and dreamed that soon they would become a married couple, which soon happened. As soon as the girl graduated from high school and she turned 18, the couple legalized the relationship. Ashley enrolled in college at the commodity manager. The newlyweds moved in with Mary. The woman insisted on it. Life itself slowly flowed further. Initially graduated from the school Jason, who got a job immediately on specialty. Afterward, Ashley received a specialty. She, too, got a job. Now the young woman dreamed that they had a child. But several years passed, and she could not get pregnant. Ashley became anxious about it. She was examined, as well as her husband, and soon Ashley received the verdict that she and her husband had different Rh factors, and it would be difficult to conceive a child. The doctor also added, in your case, getting pregnant under this circumstance will not be easy. I can add that the probability of conceiving a baby is equated to 20% out of 100. However, you can do IVF. That is my advice to you. Ashley was dumbfounded by the doctor's news, but she didn't lose hope and offered her husband to do the required procedure. The young woman piously believed that her spouse would agree to it, but Jason took the proposal of his wife in the bayonet. The man responded by saying everything should be like a normal married couple, without the intervention of any newfangled procedures. Ashley had a hard time with her spouse's answer, but she didn't want to contradict it. She still hoped that the doctors might have made a mistake. The young woman had even enrolled in medical school by correspondence. Ashley now wanted to become a midwife to figure out for herself why she could not get pregnant from her loved one. However, due to the fact that the lady could not conceive a child, scandals began to occur in the family. Jason, if initially veiledly accused his wife that she could not have children, then soon began to openly accuse the chosen one that she was empty. All the excuses of Ashley, who said that she could not get pregnant not only because of her fault, were reduced to zero. Jason blamed only his wife. Soon the man began to stay late at work. Ashley was worried, nervous. She did not want to lose her favorite person. However, family life imperceptibly shipwrecked, and one day Jason came home and began to pack his things. Ashley watched her husband in silence at first, and then she mumbled, "What are you doing?" "Can't you see? I'm leaving you. I have a woman. I'm sorry, she's expecting a baby. You have to realize we're not right for each other. It happens. I'm sorry. But we've only been together 4 years. Other couples have been together for decades and they don't have kids. And then a baby is born. Maybe you're right. But there's one thing. There's another woman expecting a baby from me, and she doesn't have to wait 10 years to get pregnant. Ashley and Jason should get a divorce, as each of them would be better off with a separate life. I'm sorry, but I have to explain to you the simple truth when you yourself understand everything perfectly well, the woman replied quietly, realizing that it was pointless to hold her husband back. He had made up his mind. Ashley looked sadly at her spouse after these words and left the house. She didn't want to see the man she loved packing his things to leave for good, which soon happened. A month passed after Jason left his wife. During that time, he came to Ashley's house only once to pick up the rest of his belongings and to tell her that he had filed for divorce. Ashley took it calmly, realizing that nothing could be changed. She only wished her ex-husband a happy farewell. Time passed. 3 years passed after the divorce. During this time, Ashley graduated from medical school, got a job in a hospital. Personal life of a young woman did not add up, although representatives of the stronger sex tried to look after her. However, Ashley was indifferent to the attention of men. Her mother was worried about this and repeatedly said, "Daughter, you can't do this. You do not think about your personal life. So many years have passed after the divorce, and you do not even want to accept the courtship of a decent man. I'm talking about Max, who lives across the street. He's been trying to get your attention for months. And you're not paying attention, Mom, you're not paying attention. Can we not start your favorite topic about my personal life?" Ashley said irritably and looked at her mother reproachfully. Mary shook her head sadly in response. A little over a month after her conversation with her mother, Ashley was coming home after work. She wondered if she really should accept her neighbor's advances. The woman went over the merits of her beau in her mind. Ashley was so engrossed in her thoughts that she didn't immediately hear the question. She looked at the brunette and said softly, "Yes, did you say something?" "I asked you where Takaya Street 63 was. You're going the wrong way. You need to turn left, and then a few houses later, another left." After that, Ashley was interrupted by a laughing stranger. "I've never been sent this far in my life. Why don't you have some time and draw me a route on a piece of paper?" "I'd rather walk you than draw it," Ashley said with a smile. "Can I really expect such a beautiful woman to be my guide?" This is my lucky day, and I have good luck in all things," exclaimed the stranger cheerfully. Ashley didn't answer, turned the other way, and walked away. The man followed her, telling her why he was in this town. From the story of the new acquaintance, who introduced himself as Alex, Ashley learned that he came here for construction, rented a place on an ad, and earned a little money. Ashley also learned that Alex was married when he was 30 years old, but the family life did not work out, and he and his wife separated by mutual consent. Hearing about the divorce, Ashley involuntarily remembered the breakup with her ex-husband. She thought that she had no relationship left with Jason after the divorce. The ex-spouse had simply packed up and disappeared from her life. The woman only heard news about him from his sister. Thinking about it, Ashley smiled sadly, which didn't escape her new acquaintance. "Why are you sad?" "I guess I'm not a good conversationalist," he said. "It's all right. We're almost there. Now you need to turn into the alley, and there you will find the right house. We are happy to help you. Let's say goodbye." "Wait, I'm not ready to let you go right away," Jason said. "Why don't you let me meet you? Or is there another way? I'll have fun now, and then you can take me to a better cafe where we can continue talking. I have to work today and I'm a little tired." "Yes, and you from the road need a break." "Whatever you say," Ashley said. "Let me give you my phone number and we'll call tomorrow and you can tell me where to go. One more thing. Why don't we go back to being on a first-name basis?" "Okay," she replied politely, then dictated her phone number and waved her hand to her new acquaintance. She turned around and hurried home. When Ashley got home, her mother came to her and anxiously asked why she was late after work. The woman hugged her mother affectionately and told her about the encounter. "Honey, what's wrong with you?" Mary exclaimed fearfully. "Were you sensible when you went with a stranger alone to see him off? What if this man was a criminal, and it was a planned operation to rob you, or even worse?" "Mom, don't panic," Ashley stopped her. "We live in the 21st century. First of all, I'm not beautiful enough to make a man want me at first sight. Second, I don't look like I have a lot of money. You can see it in my clothes. I don't wear brand name clothes. And third, Jason doesn't look like a gangster. I hope you're convinced by my arguments." Still, it was reckless. Mary sighed. "Promise me you won't do it again." "I will, Mommy," she said with a smile and hugged her mother. A few days later, Ashley met with Jason. The couple chose a small, cozy cafe to talk. The young people made an order, and then Jason asked her how things were going on the personal front. She laughed contagiously when she heard the question, and Jason was puzzled by it. "Your question about my personal life was inappropriate for the situation," Ashley explained. "If I had a boyfriend or was married, would I be sitting with you right now? Of course not. Let's just say that I was married at one time. But it didn't work out for the same reasons you are. We drifted apart. So I'm waiting for my prince to appear on the horizon. Could that be you?" "I don't know. It's too early to tell," Jason said. "It's only the second time we've seen each other. And we don't know each other. I want to tell you right away that I'm not going to get you into bed right now. Sex isn't the most important thing to me when I'm with a woman, although I don't deny that it's important too." "That's honesty," Ashley said thoughtfully and turned the conversation to another direction. After that date, the couple began to call and see each other frequently. 2 months after meeting Jason, Ashley introduced him to her mother. Mary was charmed by her daughter's gallant suitor and informed Ashley about it. "I like Jason myself. I think I'm in love." "That's wonderful." Her daughter smiled. "Has he proposed yet?" "No, he just said that I was his one and only. But you know that men are ready for beautiful words just to get into bed. I'm more interested in actions, not sweet talk." "Then I'll talk to him about it," Mary decided. "But don't do that. I'm going to be 30 in a couple years. Do you want to organize my personal life for me?" Mary smiled at her daughter's words. She didn't say anything in response. However, the older woman took it upon herself to talk to Jason about it. When Jason came to visit again, the landlady offered to have a private conversation with her under a plausible pretext. Jason was surprised by Mary's request. Soon the older woman and the man were sitting in the kitchen while Ashley ran to the store at that moment. Mary had specifically asked her daughter to go get the hammer so she could be alone with Jason. And as soon as Ashley closed the door behind her, the lady of the house asked, "Man, are you going to live your life as a guest? I mean, do you intend to marry your daughter? Are you just going to take me on like that?" Jason replied, bewildered, not expecting a conversation on the subject. In the meantime, Mary asked tricky questions that were directed in one direction only when Jason would propose. Jason's answers were slurred. Then he rose abruptly from his chair and said firmly, "I love your daughter, but can she and I decide when we should marry? I respect you, but I just didn't want to be told what to do and when to do it." "Jason, I'm not interfering with your relationship. It's just that you're not seeing the basics. You don't see Ashley changing from the unknown. I get the impression that your daughter is beginning to doubt your feelings for her." "Are you serious?" Jason asked, puzzled. "I couldn't be more serious. You talk to her about marriage, and then you'll understand," she said with a sad smile. A few days passed after that conversation. Mary was glowing in the kitchen. She knew that today her daughter should come with her boyfriend after work. The older woman cooked pilaf that day and pondered how much longer it would take Jason to propose. The landlady had set a table in the hall. She didn't like to huddle in the kitchen when guests came over. At the moment, Jason was still a guest to her, since he was not a groom. Mary put the plates on the table as she heard the front door open. The woman hurried into the hallway, where she saw her daughter entering with Jason. The man politely greeted the lady of the house and then handed a bouquet of scarlet roses with the words, "I have proposed to Ashley and she has agreed to be my other half. Now it's up to you. We want to hear you say your blessing." "Who else among us is taking the bait?" said the old woman with a grin in response. She winked conspiratorially at the man, which embarrassed him, for he remembered that he had recently addressed that word to the lady of the house. Meanwhile, Mary smiled cordially and said, "Of course I bless you. You young people have pleased me today. I hope that soon I will hear the guests shouting bitter." "You won't hear that, because we will quietly sign without any celebration. We're not 18 years old enough to have a big party," Ashley said quietly, glancing at the groom as if to suggest that he agree with her. Jason did. Soon the marriage took place. Jason came to live with his wife. Ashley was happy that she had found her happiness as a woman because she truly loved Jason. Her husband reciprocated. Mary, looking at the newlyweds, only wished them long happiness and health. Imperceptibly after the wedding, 2 years flew by. The couple occasionally had a few misunderstandings between them, but it concerned all everyday things, something Ashley didn't have time to do around the house or Jason. And at such times the couple expressed their discontent with each other. But such spats were settled the same day, and the couple went to bed reconciled. Ashley was satisfied with everything in her life except one thing: she couldn't get pregnant. Every day she called herself an outcast more and more often. One day, coming home after her shift, she walked into her bedroom, threw herself on the bed, and burst into bitter tears. Her mother came to the crying and sat down next to her daughter. The elderly woman guessed the cause of her tears. She stroked her daughter's head affectionately and said quietly, "Why are you getting upset? Don't cry, my girl. Apparently it's not yet your time to be a mom." "What are you talking about? What time is it?" "I'm already 30. Soon I won't even know what pregnancy is. I know labor is when a baby is born. But what if my husband comes a year from now and tells me he has a woman expecting a child with him? I've been there before. What do you say to that, Mom?" "First of all, calm down. Don't think about your ex-husband. He probably didn't love you enough to look outside of you. And as for Jason, he's not that kind of man. Jason loves you. I can see the way he looks at you and would do anything to make you happy with him. If he's willing to do anything, why not get checked out by the doctors? I've told him that more than once, and Jason just looks at me with sadness," Ashley tearfully told her mother. "He looks that way because it's impossible to talk to you about this topic. Jason actually wants to get a checkup. There's nothing wrong with his health. But he's not talking about it for one reason only. Jason's worried that you're stressing yourself out about not being pregnant. That's your reason. Think about it. Why is your husband keeping quiet about the checkup?" Ashley stopped crying after her mother's words and thought for a moment. She was silent for a while, thinking about what she had heard, and then she turned to her mother, suddenly buried her face in her chest and said quietly, "You can't imagine how bitter I feel now. I thought I was suffering alone. But it turns out that you are also worried about me. And also, Mom, it's getting harder for me to go to work every day." Let's take today's case, for example. We had a young girl admitted a few days ago. She just turned 18. She gave birth to a boy today. And now she's giving up her son because her boyfriend doesn't want children. You know how jealous I am. You can't even imagine. She's lucky enough to be a mom. Even in a situation where her boyfriend doesn't want kids. I'd have a baby if I were her. I'd give the guy my resignation. That's what I told her today. But she told me to stay out of her personal life. Daughter, don't try that girl's situation on yourself. You have your life, she has hers. Now try to just calm down or Jason will come over and worry about you. Okay, thanks for the support. I needed it, her daughter said quietly. Life slowly moved on. It had been 3 years since Ashley's wedding. The woman no longer hoped that she would ever become a mother, but she still had that hope in her heart. However, Ashley did not say it out loud. On the contrary, she told her husband more and more often that their family was incomplete. These statements only caused Jason more heartache, for he knew how much she dreamed of having children. When the conversation about the family being incomplete, Jason couldn't stand it and angrily asked his wife to shut up. Ashley, hearing her husband's tone, was frightened, because in such a way her husband had never allowed her to talk to him like that. When Ashley's first shock passed, the woman said, "All this is because I can't give you an heir. Stop it, please. That's not what I'm tired of. It's that you're making an issue out of the wrong place. I understand that you dream of having a child, as every woman does. But why do you keep talking about it? We've only been living for 3 years, which means we have to wait a while longer." Before the husband could finish his sentence, he was angrily interrupted by his wife. "Shut up. My first husband said the same thing to me." And what happened in the end? He found a woman who bore him a son. He didn't cheat while he was still married, all because I couldn't get pregnant. And that was the only reason I went to medical school, to become a midwife back in the day. To find out the real reason why I couldn't have children. Wait, but you told me that your divorce was because, as they say, you didn't get along. I lied. And now you know the truth and you can roll. I'm not holding you, Ashley yelled hysterically. She was about to throw their family picture at her husband as her mother Mary entered the room. Mary gave her daughter a stern look and then quietly asked Jason to leave. The man didn't object and complied with his mother-in-law's request. Once the older woman was alone with her daughter, she sat up to Ashley and spoke softly. "Aren't you ashamed of throwing a tantrum here? I understand that you're nervous. But what does this have to do with your husband? You're torturing yourself and him. Do you want that? Enjoy your life. You love each other, and you'll still have a daughter, take my word for it." "But when, Mom?" "I said she will, so she will. We just have to be patient." I've heard those words many times before. How long do I have to wait? The gynecologist told me that everything is fine with my husband's health too. But I'm still not getting pregnant after saying that. Ashley abruptly got up from the couch and ran out of the room. Immediately she ran into her husband Jason, who was looking at her with a sad look. The woman walked briskly toward the exit. Jason wanted to follow, but his mother-in-law stopped him, saying, "Don't follow Ashley. Let her get some fresh air, let her calm down. And in a motherly way, I suggest you go to church with your wife and pray. Ashley's already been there. I suggest you both go. Trust me, Jason, it won't cost you anything." "Okay, Mary," Jason replied. Some time passed. Ashley was at work in a pensive mood. The woman's thoughts were preoccupied with the fact that her menstrual cycle had gone astray. Ashley's pensive mood was noticed by the doctor on duty and asked what was going on with her. Ashley was embarrassed by the question but still told what was bothering her. The medical officer laughed upon hearing the answer and said reproachfully, "I marvel at you, woman. Take you at least, Ashley. Where do you work?" "In a maternity hospital. A midwife." "Exactly. When symptoms like these arise, where should a woman go? And given that you're also a medical professional, what are your thoughts?" "Okay. You don't have to answer that. I can see by the look on your face that the answers to the questions have occurred to you. Let's go. I'd better check you out. After a while, Ashley came out in a happy mood. The doctor informed her that she was pregnant. Upon learning the wonderful news, Ashley immediately called her spouse and then her mother. Soon she was registered at the antenatal clinic. The woman spent the first trimester in the hospital. Then the pregnancy developed without complications. And soon Ashley gave birth to a baby girl at term. The newly married parents named their daughter Amber. The couple was in the seventh heaven of happiness that they had a child. Rejoiced at this event and Ashley's mother. The woman immediately noticed that after the birth of her daughter, as if blossomed. This was noticed not only by Mary but also by neighbors, who at every opportunity said to the elderly woman how Ashley has become more beautiful after the birth of her daughter. She's glowing from the inside out with happiness. We're so happy for you. Thank you, Mary replied, and immediately recited the Lord's Prayer to herself. The old woman was afraid that with such words people might inadvertently jinx her daughter's happiness. Meanwhile, Ashley was enjoying her new role as a mom. She enjoyed fussing with her baby, singing songs, putting on her baby's cradles, feeding her baby formula from a bottle. Ashley did her best to take care of her daughter, which sometimes frustrated her mother. Mary also wanted to nurse her granddaughter, so she would occasionally say to her daughter with a sad smile, "You're like a hen. You don't let anyone near you. And I am not a stranger to the baby. I want to babysit the baby too." "Oh, Mom, Amber is my little angel. And I'm just afraid to part with her even for 5 minutes," Ashley replied. Time passed and the girl turned 3. Mary started talking about putting Amber in kindergarten. Ashley immediately flatly refused the offer, which caused her mother's bewilderment. The old woman looked at her daughter with incomprehension and said that the child needed to start contact with her peers. Ashley, hearing her mother's words, replied that she would go with her daughter to the playground where the kids were walking. Mary did not insist any further, realizing that Ashley would not be persuaded. After that conversation, a couple months flew by. Ashley walked with Amber in the public garden. The woman watched her daughter digging in the sand with her peers. Suddenly, Amber grabbed a child's shovel and knocked the girl on the head with it. The little girl cried and ran to her mother. Ashley felt bad about her daughter's behavior and approached Amber to reprimand her. Frowning her eyebrows, the mother said, "Girls." Ashley was outraged at her daughter Amber's behavior in the sandbox. She took the trowel from her and gave it to another girl, apologizing. Ashley then said the walk was over, which displeased Amber. At home, Ashley told her husband Ben what had happened. Mary, Ashley's mother, upon hearing the story, stated this is still the flowers. The berries will come later. What you don't realize, Ashley, is that your daughter lives a reclusive life and thinks everything should be done just for her. You lack discipline, and as a mother, you're indulging your child in everything. Can't you see that the girl is turning into a little selfish girl? What are you talking about, Mom? Amber is a wonderful girl. You're just looking for faults in her that aren't really there, Ashley replied. Mary turned reproachfully to her son-in-law, Ben. Why don't you say something? Amber is your daughter, too. Don't you notice anything strange about her behavior? Ben grumbled and hurried away so as not to continue the conversation. In the evening, Ashley put her daughter to bed and then joined her husband in the bedroom. Maybe Mom is right about Amber growing up selfish. After all, sometimes she doesn't ask, she demands to buy this or that toy, she said thoughtfully. I don't know what to answer. Maybe our daughter needs a little brother or sister, Ben suggested. Well, let's do that now, he said with a smile as he hugged his wife. Honey, I'm serious. Maybe we really should listen to Mom and put Amber in daycare, Ashley replied. You know, I agree with that. Mary is retiring soon. Her allowance will be small. Our family budget is going to become quite paltry, and we need to repair the roof its finances. If you get a job, we'll have extra income, Ben reasoned. A couple weeks later, Amber was enrolled in kindergarten, and Ashley went straight to work. At first, Amber was cranky and refused to go to daycare, complaining about her stomach or her leg. Lily believed it at first, but then realized that her daughter was being sly to avoid going to daycare. Ashley had a hard time convincing Amber to attend. When Amber stopped being cranky, other problems began. Caregivers complained about her behavior, saying she was acting arrogant and hurting other children. Ashley gave her daughter educational talks, but the complaints continued. Once again, when Ashley came to pick up Amber, the kindergarten teacher said Amber is an insufferable child. She doesn't get enough belt training. What did you say? With a belt? Are you out of your mind? You have a teacher's education. Ashley was outraged. How can you even mention the belt? I'm doing preventive counseling with my daughter at home. But you, too, should be helping me so that the girl adapts to her peers. Talk to the child and tell her that what she's doing is wrong. And if you and I do not find a common language, then I will have to appeal to your management. After this conversation between Ashley and the teacher, the complaints stopped, and after a while Amber was eager to go to kindergarten. Life slowly moved on. Ashley now dreamed of having a second child. She wanted to give her husband an heir. However, time passed, and the woman could not get pregnant. One evening, Ashley talked to her mother and said that she dreamed of having a second child. Mary sighed sadly after her daughter's words and sadly said, "I'll let you in on a secret. Basically, Amber is your only child, and there won't be any others." Why is that? It's because we're on our third generation of having only one child, and it's necessarily a girl. That was my grandmother's, then my mom's, and then mine. I wanted to have at least 3 too, but God gave me only you. It's an ancient prejudice. You could say it's a coincidence, though. Don't take hope away from me. I'm bound to have more. I'm sorry, daughter, I probably shouldn't have told you that. I don't want to take away your dream. I just thought you should know about it. The older woman sighed heavily and actually regretted her words. Time moved on imperceptibly, and it was about to be her 6th birthday when suddenly Mary felt sick. The woman was washing dishes in the kitchen when she felt a severe headache. The pensioner, writhing from the spasm, hurried to the kitchen cabinet, which stored medicines. However, the woman did not have time to get a pill, as she lost consciousness. Ashley discovered Mary when she returned from daycare with her daughter. The woman, seeing her mother lying on the floor, cried out desperately and rushed to her mom. Amber, hearing her mom scream, cried frightened. Meanwhile, Ashley tried to bring the pensioner to her senses, but she was unsuccessful, and then she called an ambulance. Soon Mary was hospitalized. Ashley waited for the hospital with visits. She wanted to know what was wrong with her mother. When the woman went to the doctor once again, the doctor quietly said the cancer is brain cancer. I can't say anything else, as I am not a specialist in this case. I have other specifics. You need to get to a specialized clinic as soon as possible. How so? Whispered the woman, who couldn't believe what the medical professional had just told her. That same evening, Ashley told her spouse about everything. The couple began to consider where they could find a decent amount of money to travel to the regional city. Ben suggested taking out a loan, but his wife didn't refuse. Soon Mary was taken to the regional city by her daughter. The elderly woman lay for a while in the hospital, and then Ashley came for her, who hoped that everything was not so terrible. However, the doctor's words shocked her. Stage 4. So what's wrong with that? It's not like it's a verdict. People live at this stage. You told me you're a medical professional. It's not for me to tell you what stage 4 is. Yes, people live at that stage, but the only question is how long they live. There's one thing I don't understand about your situation. How could you, a medical professional, allow your mother to have such a neglected disease? Mom rarely complained of headaches, and if she did say she had a headache, she added that it was the magnetic storms. They affect her that way, Ashley replied, hiding her face in her palms and crying desperately. The doctor put his arm around the visitor and said, "I understand your condition, but you should pull yourself together now, as you need to go to your mom. And I don't think Mary will be happy when she sees her daughter crying." Wait, shouldn't we go to the Capitol? The man in the white coat looked sadly at the lady, then shrugged his shoulders. And then the doctor went to the table, where there was a decanter, and poured water into a glass. And only after a few moments the visitor uttered, "Hope dies last." It's a folk saying. If it makes you feel better, go to Washington. They have better equipment there. But I'm not sure they'll give you a cure that'll get your mom back on her feet in no time. If I were you, personally, I would spend the money not to buy expensive drugs that won't help, but to make my mom's last days happy. Knew what she wanted and would fight to fulfill mom's dream. And if mom asks to prolong her life, then how would you fulfill your mom's wish? Ashley asked in a low voice and looked at the doctor point blank. The man hummed uncertainly, and after a few seconds he said, "I'd buy regular vitamins at the drugstore and give them to my mom. But at the same time I would tell her that these vitamins prolong life. But you would not fulfill your mother's wishes, but only make an appearance. Sometimes the appearance is life-extending." Soon the lady picked up her mother from the hospital and came home with her. The woman told her husband about the conversation with the doctor, as well as the desire to go to Washington, to which the spouse replied, "Don't you think the doctor was right when he said that the capital is unlikely to help anymore? You watch TV and see when celebrities are diagnosed with cancer, and public people spend fabulous money. And what's the result? Are you saying we should just give up and watch mom go quietly to the grave?" I'm not saying that. Don't twist my words. I'm just trying to make the point that Mary should be at home, not in a hospital room. I don't know how much longer my mother-in-law has left to live, but I'd like her to feel peaceful and uncomfortable. All right, so be it. Mary lived only 2 months after her hospitalization. It happened early one morning when the sun was just coming out. The daughter, who had been sleeping with her mother lately, found out that the person she loved was no longer in the world. At first, Ashley felt guilty for not realizing in time when her mother complained of headaches. Ben tried to reason with his wife to stop tormenting herself. However, after such support, the woman went into a screaming fit. And when once again Ashley blamed herself for not looking after her mother, the head of the family said, "You're getting paranoid. Stop being hysterical and let it go. Don't you realize you're becoming toxic? It's all because of your speculation. You're not just hurting yourself, you're hurting me and my daughter. You don't understand anything. I'm a medical professional, and I should have responded to mom's complaints. And I didn't. And as a result, mom is no longer alive. It's my fault she passed away so early. Oh, honey, you're really getting on my nerves. Why don't you stop beating yourself up? I think you should take a vacation with your daughter right before Amber starts first grade. Get some rest and relaxation. I'd go with you, but I don't have vacation until October. What do you think of my offer?" asked the husband and hugged his wife, who was still sobbing. The woman only nodded in response. She no longer had the strength to argue with her husband. Soon Ashley and her daughter left on a trip to the Gulf Coast. The woman was glad that Ben had insisted on the trip. Ashley spent a week at the sea with her daughter, and now it was the last day. Before leaving, Amber asked her mom to go to the beach one last time to admire the sea. Ashley did not refuse the child, and soon mother and daughter were already walking barefoot on the soft golden sand. Every now and then the girl ran to the water to touch the water with her toe. Ashley was watching her daughter when someone called her name. The woman looked back in bewilderment and saw her ex-husband Jason walking toward her. Ashley stared at him in amazement. Jason approached the woman and said hello in a friendly manner before mouthing, "Taking a vacation. I heard from my sister that you have a daughter. Congratulations, you've been dreaming of having kids. Thank you. So many years have not seen each other, although we live in the same city. But we met at the sea. Listen, let's go sit in a cafe and talk. You and I have a lot to remember. You haven't changed a bit since the baby was born. You're just as petite as before. I'd love to reminisce with you about our pranks in bed. Thank you for the invitation, but I must refuse you. My daughter and I are leaving today, and you'd be better off with your wife, because I have a man I love, and I'm not attracted to the side, unlike you," Ashley replied softly, disgusted by her ex-husband's tone about intimacy. Meanwhile, Jason frowned and said wistfully, "We're not making love to my wife right now. She's 2 months away from giving birth, and she's blown to smithereens. I told my husband to terminate the pregnancy. After all, there are already 2 children, and she said that she will give birth to a 3rd. So it's wonderful that you have so many children. Children are happiness. But I just don't understand why you walk on the beach without your soulmate and children. My wife's at home, and I'm here on business, like on a business trip. My father-in-law is a businessman. So he sent me down here for a couple days. Well, good luck with your business. We should get going with our daughter, Ashley said quietly and beckoned her daughter over to her. The woman took the girl's hand and they headed towards the exit of the beach. Ashley walked at that moment and thought how lucky Jason's wife was to already have 2 children and to be carrying a baby under her heart at this time. Soon Ashley and her daughter arrived home. They were gushing over Ben about what a wonderful time they had. Amber took a handful of sand out of her backpack to make her daddy happy. Ashley laughed when she saw it. Her husband looked at his wife in bewilderment, but she was even more amused when she saw Ben's amazed face. When the first emotions from the sand had passed, Ashley explained the reason for her laughter. She told her husband that she had hidden something in her backpack the night before she left. Ashley hadn't thought much of it at the time, but as she put her daughter's backpack on her shoulders, she wondered why it was so heavy. Ben, still not realizing anything, looked into his daughter's backpack and immediately chuckled, and through a fit of laughter turned to his daughter. "You wanted so much to please Daddy that you stuffed the whole backpack with sand. That's a good girl to please your father. So you were sunbathing in the sun like me and Mom. And now you can fill a trough with water, pour sand on the ground next to it. And it's like you're having a vacation at the sea. It's great, isn't it? You're so good at it." "That's a wonderful idea. And Jackson Sunshine, Daddy will give you a kiss for being clever." Life moved on, and soon it was time to go to first grade. On the eve of that event, Ashley put her daughter to bed and headed into the hall to iron her white apron. She spread the bedspread on the board, and then laid the apron down thoughtfully and spoke softly. "How quickly time runs. You too. Our daughter is going to first grade tomorrow. As my mother used to tell me, it's worth it for a child to go to school, then time will fly by after that imperceptibly." "Is that you talking to yourself?" pronounced Ben, who had just entered the room and heard his spouse's phrase. "I'm saying that you and I are getting a little old now. And you know, my mom was right when she said that all women in our line give birth to only one child. And it's always a girl. Oh, that's so lucky. You and me were in the prime of our lives. And as for the one-child thing, that's just prejudice. That's what I told my mother. But you see, I can't get pregnant again." "That's all right. We still have a whole cartload of time. Drop what you're doing and let's go into the bedroom to make a baby," Ben said and winked excitedly at his spouse. Ashley smiled and said, "I was having a serious conversation with you." "And you're at it again?" "I'm being quite serious too. And about the kids, I can only say this: we have a daughter. And we should be happy about it. We need to get Amber on her feet so she can go to school and get a good life in the future." And so Amber has already started first grade. Her mother and father alternately took her daughter to and picked her up from school. The girl studied willingly, and soon parents often heard praise from the class teacher. Ashley and her husband were only happy. The first half of the year flew by. Amber became friends with a classmate. The girl's name was Christina. Friends spent a lot of time together. The parents of the girls were only happy about this friendship, which did not affect the performance at school. And now it was spring. The time of summer vacation was approaching. Amber came home alone. She had already been released to school alone after the winter. The girl came home and went to her room without greeting her mother, who was busy in the kitchen. Ashley was curious as to why her daughter had done that. The woman wiped her hands on a towel and proceeded to the nursery, where she saw her upset daughter. The homeowner approached the girl and asked what had happened. Amber glanced glumly at her mom and immediately, almost tearfully, said, "Christina. Her parents bought her rollerblades, as well as a helmet, elbow pads, and knee pads. I want to go rollerblading in the summer too." "And what are you getting upset about? Daddy will come over and talk to him about it." "It's all words. Dad already promised me a bicycle." "And what? He bought a junk bike. It's a shame to even ride it in the yard. Dad bought me the bike I pointed out in the store, and then suddenly I needed another one. He said, ride this one first, and then you can get another bike. I don't need a bike now. I want rollerblades." In the evening, Ben came home from work, as his daughter immediately ran up to him and asked him to buy rollers. The head of the family, after a little thought, promised his daughter to make the purchase. Ashley heard the answer. The spouse did not interfere in the conversation between father and daughter. However, when Amber went to bed, Ashley emphatically stated that she was against the purchase. Ben looked at his wife in amazement and asked, "Why do you disapprove of rollerblading?" "She's too young for the sport. Amber is a girl, not a boy. It's more appropriate for her to play with her dolls, not run around on those rollerblades like tomboys everywhere." "Wait, honey, you know what kids are like these days. Girls only play dolls in kindergarten, and once they go to school, their priorities change. And anyway, how can you imagine our daughter's friend rollerblading and Amber looking at her with envy? It's a very interesting picture. And if Christina bought a live tiger tomorrow, would you run out and buy that animal for your daughter too? Why make it so complicated?" "Okay, if you promised your daughter, then buy the rollers. But I warn you right away that you will walk with Zlata when she starts to learn to ride them." "Whatever you say, my queen." Ashley ah-hed when she heard the sum. However, the woman glanced at her daughter, who was looking at the roller skates with wild delight. Afterward, Ashley smiled at her spouse and said, "Look at how happy our daughter is about these rollerblades. As they say, what's a little something for a child to be happy about? Okay, go outside and try out the accessories and then tell us about the progress." The time went on its own. At first, Ben accompanied his daughter and her friend on outings after work. And then, when Amber became more confident on rollers, the family decided that the girl would ride only in the park and never on the roadway. Amber happily agreed to this proposal, as she was already tired of her dad accompanying her. And Christina's father does not do it. June and then July flew by. Ashley was coming home from her shift. She rode on the shuttle bus and smiled as she recalled her day at work. Soon the driver announced a stop. The woman got out of the vehicle and headed to the nearest store to buy milk and eggs. Ashley was going to make an omelet for dinner. The woman had already approached the store when she heard her spouse calling her. Ashley turned around and asked what he was doing here. Ben smiled and pronounced, "I wanted to meet you from work, but I guess I didn't time it right." "There's something you're not telling me, honey. Spill what happened," the woman mumbled worriedly. Ben, seeing his wife's reaction, laughed and immediately said, "It's actually our boss's anniversary. He let everyone go home early, but I wasted my time and cooked dinner at home myself. And then I saw that there was no bread at home and hurried to the store, where I saw you. And I thought something had happened to my daughter," Ashley said, relieved. Then she smiled and said, "Let your boss have a holiday every day then. I'll be spared the cooking then." Imagine how happy that would be for a woman. "By the way, I forgot to ask, what did you cook?" "Flotsam pasta is my specialty. You know very well that cooking is not my business. That's what I have you for. Now you tell me how your day at work went." Ashley looked lovingly at her husband. Then she told him that she'd had a hard day at work. He asked why it had been tiring at work. Ashley smiled and said, "Although it's a hard day, it's a joyful one. A woman gave birth to triplets today. Imagine. She's 38 years old and this is her first labor. You should have seen this woman in labor when she was given her first baby in her arms. That woman's eyes were full of happiness. That's the first time I've seen eyes like that in so many years. And the funniest thing is that when she was transferred from the labor room to the ward, she began to wonder how she would feed 3 babies because she had only 2 breasts. Our medical staff, everyone who was in the ward, just fell down laughing. They found something to laugh about. If I were a woman, I might be interested in that question too. Although, I admire our woman in labor because she gave birth at 38. And you've given up on the whole thing. We should do the same thing tonight, as soon as we put our daughter to bed. And maybe don't even hint to me that you had a hard day's work or a headache. You won't get away from me today," he said with a smile. "Let's go home then. Can't wait to taste your specialty," said the wife with a laugh and took her husband under her elbow. And so it was already the end of August. School was a few days away. Amber walked up to her mom and asked to go for a walk. Ashley had the day off today. She glanced out the window and then turned to her daughter. "It's okay to walk, but just no rollerblades." Amber frowned and immediately inquired, "Why no rollerblades?" "The weather's turning bad. It's supposed to rain. Maybe you and Christina can sit with us today and play on the laptop," Mom replied. So much for Mom's idea. There were only a few days left until school started, and then there would definitely be no time to go for a ride. "Mom, let me go. Christina and I will skate carefully, as always. Mom, you're the best in the world. My favorite. You know I can't refuse you when you ask me to. Go on, take a walk, said the woman and kissed her daughter on the top of her head. As soon as the girl jumped out of the door, the woman felt a vague uneasiness in her soul. Ashley was about to run out after her daughter and call her home when her cell phone rang. The woman was distracted by the phone call and then went out into the yard. But her daughter was not there, of course. It had been about 2 hours since Amber had gone for a walk. Ashley still felt a heaviness in her soul. The woman dialed her daughter and asked how they were doing. Amber cheerfully replied that everything was fine and immediately disconnected the connection. Hearing her daughter's voice made Ashley feel a little calmer. Another hour passed before Amber left for her walk. Ashley started the laundry. She pulled out her daughter's terrycloth robe as there was a loud knock on the door. At the same time, the woman heard Christina crying. Ashley hurried to the door, and as soon as she opened it, she saw Christina's crying face. The landlady asked anxiously, "What happened?" Amber was hit by a car, she said through her sobs. "I came straight to you." "What do you mean, hit by a car? What are you talking about? Where's Amber?" "They took her away in an ambulance," Christina said through sobs. Ashley sucked in air with her mouth and then asked the girl where it had happened. When she found out where the hit and run had happened, the woman rushed to the scene of the tragedy without changing her slippers. When she got there, she saw a small crowd of gawkers, as well as a cordon of the place on the stretch of road. The woman, pushing people, rushed to the place. As soon as she got there, she saw the chalked silhouette of a child on the pavement, as well as brown bloodstains. Not far away, Ashley spotted a helmet. The helmet belonged to her daughter, and at the same moment the woman lost consciousness. Ashley woke up in the hospital. Sitting next to her was her husband Ben, who was holding her hand. As soon as Ben saw that his wife came to her senses, he immediately jumped up and ran out into the hallway, where he loudly called a nurse. A girl in a white coat hurried into the room. She approached Ashley and asked how the woman was feeling. Ashley waved her hand and wanted to get up. Her husband wouldn't let her. Then the woman asked her spouse, "What about your daughter?" "She's alive. Amber's in the ICU. The doctors are fighting for her life. Help me up. I need to be near my daughter. My presence will help her." "You just had a heart attack, and you can't get up," Ben said quietly but firmly. He wanted to add something else, but at that moment the doctor entered the room and came up to Ashley and said, "Are you awake? That's great. You're going to be given an injection, and then try to sleep. I'm not going to be here. Let's get you the papers you need to sign to refuse hospitalization." "Ashley, do I really need to tell you as a medical professional what the consequences of refusing medical care are?" The man in the white coat said sternly. "That's exactly what I know. That is why you should not waste your precious time now and explain to me the plain truths which I already know without you." The doctor looked at Ben after the woman's words, but he only waved his hands, thus making it clear that he could not influence his spouse in this situation. And after a while, Ashley was near the entrance to the intensive care unit. She prayed to God that her daughter would survive. Ben at this time stood near the window and looked at the sill with a hateful look. Some time passed. Ashley walked over to her husband and quietly touched his elbow. The husband immediately flinched at the touch and turned to his wife. He put his arm around Ashley and then pressed the woman's head against his chest and immediately felt her crying. Ben asked her to calm down, but the woman didn't respond to her husband's words. Ben became nervous. He was worried that his wife might have a second stroke. The man wanted to run after the nurse as he was stopped by his spouse, who faintly said, "Tell me what happened." "I can't tell you much." Anyway, the girls were already rollerblading home. They needed to pass the zebra. As here Christina had a slip on her lap, she bent down to correct it, and her daughter at the same time moved across the road, and then a foreign car flew out. Amber didn't have time to react and a hit and run occurred. Christina was saved from the collision by her knee pads. Witnesses called an ambulance and police officers. The investigator told me the driver fled the scene. But he's already been arrested. He was under the influence of alcohol when he hit our daughter. Ben was silent, looked at his wife, who only clenched her hands in a fist. The woman's face had gone pale. Ashley didn't say anything, she just stood there staring at one point. The man did not know how to behave in this situation, so once again pressed his wife to him and gently said, "Everything will work out, and our daughter will still recover." "I want that bastard to get the maximum punishment," Ashley told him. "That criminal will get what he deserves. Right now, I think you should go home so you can recover." "No home, our little girl needs us here." "Okay, sweetheart." It was another couple hours before 2 doctors came out of the ICU. Ashley rushed over to them and grabbed one doctor by the chest. The man in the white coat tried to pull his hands off the woman, but he was unsuccessful. And then the second doctor turned to the lady's husband. "We did everything we could here, but the girl suffered many injuries. We couldn't save her." Ashley, as soon as she heard this, pushed the doctor away, then sobbed loudly. She then turned to her husband and started beating her fists on his chest, shouting, "It's your fault. It's your fault. I was against these videos. How am I supposed to live without my little girl?" One of the doctors quickly realized that the woman was hysterical. The man in the white coat shouted something to the nurse, who came out to the noise. The lady was given an injection and soon she fell asleep. Ben was next to his wife the whole time. And as soon as the spouse woke up, she asked to take her home. The man complied with the request without any objection. Amber's funeral soon followed. All this time, Ashley was in prostration. She did not understand why so many people had come to the cemetery, and also did not realize why those present were expressing their condolences to her. It wasn't until the coffin was being lowered into the hole that Ashley realized it was her baby girl being buried. The woman shrieked, ran to the coffin, wrapped both arms around it, and screamed, "Don't. I can't let my daughter go to her final resting place alone. I want to lie next to her." From the coffin, Ashley was able to tear Ben together with her father, who came to the funeral of his granddaughter. The woman was then picked up by neighbors and hurriedly taken away from the cemetery. At home, Ashley could not sit down at the table to memorialize her daughter as she became ill with heart trouble. Her spouse called an ambulance and the woman was hospitalized. Several days passed after the funeral. Ben visited his spouse daily, although it was a long drive. "We still don't know when the trial will be. Be patient, my dear, let's get better at my place," he told her. "Why should I get better if our daughter is no longer in this world?" Ashley replied, "I realize that we lost our only child, but don't forget that I need you, that I love you, and I can't lose you. And Amber wouldn't want that either." Some time passed. Ashley was released from the hospital and went to work. The days seemed like torture for the woman. Ashley hated the nights most of all, as sleep was non-existent. She had fleeting visions of her daughter coming to her and asking her to punish the man who hit her. Ben saw that his wife could not find peace until she knew what punishment the driver would receive, and soon the trial took place. As it turned out, that driver was some local oligarch. The defendant got off with a fine. It was twisted to mean that Amber was crossing the road in the wrong place. Amber's testimony disappeared from the case, and a whole new set of witnesses came forward. When Ashley found out about it, she went door to door with the D.A.'s office, the police, the DMV. But everywhere she was pointed at the door. The woman was desperate, and after another visit to the investigator, she came home and drank a few shots of whitewater. Ashley literally immediately became tipsy, as strong drinks were not spoiled. When her husband came home from work, her wife said to him in an inebriated voice, "How can you live peacefully in this world when our daughter is gone because of your fault? First of all, you, my dove, are drunk. Let's talk about it tomorrow when you're sober. I want to tell you everything now. You're not really a man. The man who ruined my daughter is out there, and you didn't even lift a finger to avenge him. What can I do when money rules the world now? Don't you understand that? What do you think I should do? Go to that oligarch and throw him from the 5th floor. Would that make you feel better? Only I'd have to go to jail for it, because I don't have the money to pay him off. I'd go and throw him from the 5th floor. Maybe then my daughter would stop coming to me at night. Ben did not say anything to his wife, only took the bottle of hot drink from her hands. And afterward, the man retired to the nursery to ponder how to help his wife overcome the loss of her only daughter. Sasha did not sleep all night, and the only thing that came to his mind was to take his wife to the bishop in the church, which he soon did. After the church visit, the lady was now less often visited by her daughter in dreams. Time moved on imperceptibly, and now a year has passed since Amber was buried. During this time, the lady had hardened a bit. Whereas she used to come to work in high spirits, now she disliked women in labor. The woman did not tell anyone about it. But the team has already noticed that Ashley often rudely treats future moms. The chief Dr. Jackson Michael repeatedly made his subordinate remarks on this matter. The woman promised to correct herself, but everything was repeated again. And once Ashley, together with the doctor, delivered a woman in labor. The young woman was in labor for the first time. And when the contractions began, she screamed that she was in pain. Ashley considered the future mommy hysterical, and the words of the doctor made remarks to her, and after the birth wrote a report to the chief doctor. Jackson Michael familiarized himself with the document and called Ashley to his office. As soon as the woman entered, the master of the office seriously said, "This can't go on any longer. If before, everyone wanted you to assist in childbirth, but now women in labor, just hearing your name, frightened. Maybe you should go to the sea with your husband, get away for a while. I understand your grief that you lost a child, but our patients are not to blame. Let's find some common ground, otherwise we'll go our separate ways, even though you're an excellent midwife. Now, I want an answer from you. I'm going to reconsider how I treat my patients. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." I've heard that before. Ashley, why don't you give me one last chance? Okay? You might want to think about taking a vacation. A change of scenery for a while is good for a person, especially in your situation. Ashley came home in a gloomy mood. She went into the kitchen to make dinner, but immediately changed her mind and went into the living room, where she turned on the TV. The woman didn't watch the program at all. She was thinking about how to continue going to work. Ashley was distracted from her thoughts by her husband, who sat down next to her and said affectionately, "How was your workday? A lot of women gave birth today? Why are you interested? Honey, what's the matter with you? Actually, I've always been interested in that. Then from now on, stop doing it. How I'm sick of everything. How I'm sick of everything," said the wife nervously. Ben frowned after his wife's words and then said firmly, "Tell me what happened at work." Ashley didn't talk herself into it twice, but honestly recounted the conversation with the head doctor. Ben was silent for a long time after his wife's narration, and then asked why she had developed a dislike for laboring women. Ashley thought for a moment, and then, looking her husband in the eye, confessed, "You know, I look at their happy faces when they're presented with a baby, and it's like I get an electric shock inside, and it's because they're moms, and I'm never going to get to experience that. It's moments like that when it's like I'm possessed. I can't help it. In that case, should you quit this job? You can't force yourself to do something you don't want to do. I get the impression that you've grown to hate being a midwife and find no outlet in this job." "What do you mean quit? Do you want me to sit in four walls and slowly go insane?" "I'm not suggesting you sit at home. You could get a job as a clerk in a small store. I think you'll be able to balance your debit and credit. Or maybe we should really go on vacation somewhere in the country, take a tent, fishing rods, and spend a week in solitude, and then think about changing jobs." "Okay, let's do that, honey." Soon the couple went on vacation to Ben's father's house in the country. The couple had a great time. They often went to nature, where they fished in the lake, and then together they picked berries. Ashley then confessed to her husband that it was a pity that they did not go on vacation when Amber was alive. The husband did not answer anything to his wife, as he realized that if he said a word, his wife would start crying. A week later, the couple went back. Ben, upon arrival, asked his wife if she could go out to work in the maternity ward. Ashley replied in agreement. The woman actually believed the trip had changed her internally, and soon Ashley was on shift. The first day was fine, but after a week the same feeling of resentment returned to her. Ashley tried to fight her envy. She even pinched her arm to keep from being rude. It had been about a month since the vacation. Ashley arrived at work and mentally wished to herself that there were as few women as possible wanting to be moms today. Ashley had no idea what a difficult shift she was about to have. And it had all started when Taylor Grieving, the doctor on duty, had her daughter's fever. The young woman asked, "Check to see if you can handle it on your own today, especially with 4 hours left in the shift. Just understand I am divorced from my husband, and there is no one to look after my daughter, and I'm worried about her. She's got a fever of 38.8. She called me the other day." Taylor Grieving, go with peace of mind. I've never delivered a baby on my own, have I? And there's someone to help you if you need it. The head doctor's on call today. By the way, did you ask him to leave? Otherwise he'll ask me and I won't answer, and I'll get in trouble. Yeah, I talked to him. He's a man of the world and he recognized my situation right away. He also said that if Ashley was working, there was nothing to worry about. That head doctor of ours is flattering me. All right, go ahead, Taylor Grieving. You'll be running an even higher fever by the time you get home to your daughter. Just as Ashley escorted the woman out, a nurse announced that there were 2 women in labor. Ashley sighed to herself and hurried into the exam room. There was one middle-aged woman in there who had been brought in by ambulance. Ashley began to ask the patient questions in a businesslike manner. Just then, the head doctor entered the room and addressed the midwife. "This is going to be fun today. You're taking care of this woman, and I'm about to have a difficult labor." Ashley sighed sorrowfully and hurried to examine the woman. As soon as she saw the patient's chart, she immediately shuddered in displeasure. The woman in labor, Rachel Lionel, was 58 years old. After all the necessary procedures, the woman in labor was taken to the labor room. Ashley was clearly giving commands as to how the patient should proceed. Rachel Lionel responded by moaning and begging for the baby to be saved. Ashley was angry with the woman, unable to suppress her anger. And when the woman in labor moaned again, the midwife said angrily, "You're crazy. How could you think of giving birth at the age of 58? Now keep quiet and do as you're told." The labor was difficult. Ashley was completely exhausted. She would have been happy to have the help of the chief of medicine. But Jackson Michael was delivering triplets, and he was having a hard time with it too. And when the workday was over, Ashley breathed a sigh of relief. Now the only thing she wanted to do was come home, take a bath, and go to bed. This day she even changed her principles. She called a cab to get to her place of residence. Previously, she had not allowed herself such expenses. Soon the woman was already at home, where she was met by her husband Ben. He offered his wife to eat, but she waved away and said that she did not want anything, as the day was stressful. Afterward, Ashley said she delivered a baby for an elderly woman. Her husband whistled in surprise and said in amazement, "I can't believe what kind of women we have here." The next day at lunchtime, Ashley received a call from the chief physician, who ordered her to report to work. The woman was often called by her superiors, so she involuntarily had a thought, and whether this call is not connected with yesterday's elderly woman in labor. There was no time to ponder, however, and Ashley drove to the hospital. As soon as she got to the second floor, where the chief physician's office was, a nurse ran up to her and whispered, "Ours is out of control, vomiting and swearing." "What's the reason?" "You know, he said something about the woman in labor yesterday." The girl in the white coat wanted to add something, but then the door opened and the head doctor appeared and said, "I was just waiting for you, Ashley. Come on, let's go have a talk." The first to enter the office was the chief physician, who stood by the desk, tapping his fingers nervously on it. Ashley came in after the man, and she knew from the doctor's demeanor that he was going to get a scolding, since he was rarely this angry. As the woman closed the door, Jackson Michael came right up to her and said sternly, "What are you doing? I am well aware that today both you and I have a day off after yesterday's duty, but I get a call from a doctor saying that a woman in labor wants to get to know me. I wouldn't have responded to this request if I hadn't been told who this woman was. Do you happen to have any idea who this woman might be?" "I do," Ashley replied. "Rachel Lionel Kopylova gave birth to a baby girl." "That's right. When I went to see her, she was curious about the midwife who delivered her baby. Naturally, I asked what was wrong. Rachel wouldn't tell me what the situation was, but it was clear she wasn't happy about what you'd done. And now I'll tell you for your understanding that this woman in labor is the wife of a very famous man in the regional city. And if now we are tortured with checks, the stumbling block will be you, because your tongue says nasty things. I'd like to add that if I fire you, your husband will get it too, and so will I for that matter. Wait a minute, Ashley said. If this lady is the wife of a respectable man, why did she come here to give birth? Why didn't she give birth in her own town? You're asking me these questions? The head doctor was indignant. You don't understand the seriousness of the situation. I'm not interested in why Rachel ended up in our hospital. Ashley was more concerned with the aftermath of her shift. She wasn't going to rant about it. You go on your knees and beg for forgiveness, birthing girl. Basically do whatever it takes to earn her favor. The doctor gestured toward the door, letting her know that the conversation was over. Ashley walked out of the office. Her face was burning. The woman didn't know how to start a conversation with the woman in labor, whom she had insulted. Nevertheless, Ashley pulled herself together and headed toward the room. She knocked on the door and then entered. Immediately, her attention was caught by the way Rachel Lionel was admiring her newborn daughter. Ashley hesitated, letting her know she was in the room. She turned at the sound and looked at the midwife intently. I want to apologize to you, Ashley spoke first. I behaved inappropriately with you yesterday. I'll get down on my knees if you want me to. But please forgive me. I didn't know whose wife you were. Don't clean it. Are you saying that if I were the wife of a locksmith or a janitor, you wouldn't feel guilty about talking to a woman in labor like that? Rachel Lionel said sternly and looked reproachfully at the midwife. Ashley at that moment was ready to fall to the ground in shame, because she realized that she had said something stupid. But she answered nonetheless. I wouldn't feel guilty. Well, thank you for your honest answer. If you lied now, I'd lose the last shred of respect for you. Now tell me, why are you so rude to women in labor? Don't deny it, since I've been doing a little checking up on you around here. Ashley looked at Rachel with a sad look, and then tears ran down her cheeks. The midwife, without knowing why, told this woman how she had lost her baby, that the perpetrator had gotten off scot-free after the hit and run, and told her that she dreamed of becoming a mom, but it wasn't happening. Therefore, when women of advanced age give birth, she is filled with anger and envy. Rachel listened attentively to the interlocutor. Then she smiled sadly. She invited the midwife to sit down next to her, then took her hand and asked her to stop crying. Ashley wiped her tears away with the palm of her hand. While smearing mascara on her face, Rachel immediately held out a damp washcloth with the words, "Are you now, like a lost sheep, aware of our fate? Related. At one time, I couldn't get pregnant for a long time either. And when it did happen, it was a miracle for me and my husband. My husband at that time was still a small official in the administration. And then my son grew up and against parental will, after serving in the army, went to the hot spot. My husband and I hoped that the trouble would pass us by. However, the miracle did not happen. Our boy died. We could not recover from this tragedy for a long time. But as they say, time heals. My husband moved up the career ladder, and that's when I had the idea that I could still have a child. I was examined in many clinics, but the doctors were throwing up their hands. And then came the decision to do IVF. My husband and I consulted. He is 7 years younger than me, and we came to a mutual agreement that we could take a risk. And the risk justified our expectations. We have a daughter. The main thing is that our health should be good. Ashley sat in silence after Rachel's story. The woman's story had touched something in her soul. Meanwhile, Jackson Michael paced nervously around the office, wondering if Ashley had made amends, and unable to bear it, the man strode into the room, where he saw a peaceful conversation between the women, who smiled at each other. The chief physician came out in bewilderment. The only thing he realized was that the conflict was over. Meanwhile, Ashley smiled embarrassedly and asked the question she had been wondering about the late pregnancy. It's understandable. I'm happy for you, but I just don't understand why you came to give birth in a provincial town. I didn't really want to come here, Rachel answered Lionel. But immediately, becoming serious, she continued. My husband went on a business trip to New York. I was against this trip, but my husband is still an enthusiast, likes to be in the know. My spouse was away for 2 days and should have been back by now. Then I got the call that he had a heart attack. I could not stay at home and drove myself by car to that city. However, the nervousness had taken its toll. I felt the baby wanted to be born, so your town came up. And in the morning my husband called and said that he is doing well and he will be here soon. I had to scold him and scare him that if he leaves the hospital without permission, our daughter will be taken away from the hospital. My blackmail succeeded. What a brave woman you are. Ashley said with admiration. I'm not brave. I just love my husband as much as he loves me. And yet I envy you, but with white envy. I mean, you realized your dream and became a mom. Can you do it too? You're a midwife and you know what IVF is. I do, but I'm afraid my husband wouldn't like it, Ashley said quietly. And that's where you're wrong. From your story, your husband loves you and would do anything to make you happy. My advice is to go for it. Just don't hurt any more women in labor. I give you my word it won't happen again. Meeting you and your story changed something in my soul. And you know I'm very happy about it.